Get comfortable. Settle in wherever you are. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they've been carrying themselves today, and let your hands go still, and let the ceiling above you just be there without needing to mean anything. We are going to spend some time in Springfield tonight. Not the Springfield of the headlines or the highlight reels, and the same 5 clips that get reshared every time someone notices a new so-called prediction. The Springfield underneath all of that. The one that gets stranger and richer and more layered the longer you spend inside it. The one that rewards patience and attention, and the particular quality of consciousness that arrives in the hours just before sleep when the critical mind goes quiet and things land differently than they do in the middle of an ordinary day. Tonight we are ranking 30 facts about The Simpsons in order of how strange they are. 30 is mildly odd. 1 is the kind of thing that, once you've sat with it, changes the shape of what you thought you were watching every time you've ever watched it. Some of these are facts about production. Some are facts about characters and their histories. Some are facts about the show's relationship with time and culture, and the lives of the people who made it, and the people who watched it, and the people who, one way or another, ended up part of its story. Some of them are theories supported by enough canonical evidence to be treated as close to fact. All of them are real. None of them were made up for this. The ranking moves from the bottom up, 30-1. Each section takes you a little deeper into territory that requires more sitting with. By the time we reach the top, we'll be somewhere that feels different from where we started, the kind of attention that feels more like floating than thinking, more like drifting than arriving. So, find your breath, slow it a little, and let's begin. Section 1. Facts 30. Through 26 tier, mildly unusual. These are the facts that live in the comfortable, shallow end of the strange. They register as interesting, maybe surprising, maybe worth filing away. They don't disturb anything. They're the kind of detail that adds a small new texture to the show you thought you knew, a slight increase in richness, a minor revision of something you'd assumed without questioning. They don't keep you up at night. They're company for the drifting. Fact number 30. The Simpsons has employed over 1,000 different writers across its run, which makes Springfield's consistency as a place one of the stranger creative achievements in the history of television. Think carefully about what that number means in practice. 1,000 individual human beings, 1,000 different sets of life experience, political instinct, comedic timing, literary reference, cultural memory, personal grief, and accumulated strangeness, all poured into the same fictional town in the same fictional American state whose location nobody has ever been able to pin down. Television shows are not typically built this way. Most long-running series operate with a writer's room of somewhere between 10 and 25 people at any given time, with a showrunner at the center maintaining a consistent vision, a gravitational pull that keeps creative decisions oriented around a single sensibility. When showrunners change, shows change with them, sometimes dramatically, sometimes subtly, but perceptibly, to anyone paying close enough attention to the work across the transition. The Simpsons has had that central vision in various forms at various points in its history, but the sheer volume of human creative input over its run, the extraordinary turnover, the writers who came through for a single season and left, who stayed for 5 years and moved on, who returned after gaps, who wrote one script that got produced and never came back, all of it makes Springfield something that should not hold together as well as it does. And yet it holds. Not perfectly. The continuity errors are famous and extensively documented. The tonal shifts between eras are real and have been debated with genuine passion by the show's community for decades. The Homer of Season 3 is not exactly the same as the Homer of Season 25. The gap is legible in ways that go beyond quality changes, registering as something more like a shift in the character's center of gravity, the things he cares about most, the way he processes his own failures. But the town remains the same town. The texture of Springfield persists across the 1,000 different sets of hands that have worked on it. The diner is still there. The tavern is still open. Burns is still in his office at the plant. Homer is still falling asleep at his workstation. The Simpson house on Evergreen Terrace has the same impossible floor plan it's always had. Something holds. Part of what holds is the characters themselves, who are so precisely defined at their essential core that they function as a self-correcting system. You cannot write Homer as genuinely self-aware without the story pushing back. You cannot make Marge resigned or cynical without something fundamental feeling wrong. The archetypes are clear enough and stable enough that even a writer working on a single episode, who will never see the character again and has no long-term stake in where they go, instinctively understands what these people will and won't do, what register they live in, what they're capable of, and what they aren't. But there is something beyond the character's stability that holds Springfield together. Something harder to name. 1,000 writers across 4 decades were all reaching for the same thing. A specific texture of American experience. Suburban and exhausted and funny and a little bit heartbreaking. The feeling of being a person in a place that doesn't quite match the life you imagined you'd have, held together by the people around you in ways that aren't entirely logical but are entirely real. The mundane miracle of a family that stays together not because everything is fine, but because they've decided that staying together matters more than everything being fine. 1,000 different sets of hands, all trying to capture the same thing. Most of them getting close enough that the seams between them become invisible. The show is made of those invisible seams. It always has been. Fact number 29. Matt Groening named almost every character in Springfield after streets in his hometown of Portland, Oregon, embedding his own childhood geography inside the most-watched animated show in television history without most viewers ever knowing. The Simpson family's first names came directly from Groening's own family. His father was Homer. His mother was Margaret, known as Marge. His sisters were Lisa and Maggie. Bart was an invention, an anagram of the word brat, which Groening has confirmed was entirely deliberate and which tells you something useful about how he thought about the character from the very beginning. The name contains the character. The character contains the name. They arrive together. But the broader population of Springfield, the names of its residents and minor characters and beloved recurring faces, came from somewhere more specific and more hidden. Groening grew up on the west side of Portland, Oregon, and the streets and neighborhoods of that part of the city were mapped almost directly into the town he invented. Carney, the school bully, takes his first name from Carney Street. Ned Flanders takes his surname from Flanders Street, one of Portland's significant arteries. Lovejoy, the reverend who tends to Springfield's spiritual needs with a weary pragmatism that suggests he's been doing it too long, takes his name from Lovejoy Street. Van Houten is a neighborhood name. Terwilliger, the real surname of Sideshow Bob, is a place name in southwest Portland. A canyon and a road and a part of the city's geography that anyone who grew up there would know from driving through it. Burnside, one of Portland's most prominent east-west streets, contributes something to the texture of Burns's name. Groening planted his childhood geography inside the cultural artifact that would be seen by hundreds of millions of people across the world, and he did it quietly enough that most of those people have never had any reason to know it was there. Portland residents who are also Simpsons fans carry a specific experience when watching the show. They hear the street they grew up on spoken aloud by voice actors who've never been to their city, attached to cartoon characters who exist in a fictional state that isn't Oregon. The geography of their childhood is the population of someone else's imaginary town. There's something genuinely strange about that act of embedding. The specific choice to hide your hometown inside a work that would be seen everywhere. It's a way of being present in something vast without announcing yourself. The streets Groening saw out of car windows as a kid, the names on signs in a Pacific Northwest city that had nothing to do with the show's premise, they're in every episode, in the mouths of characters speaking to audiences, in countries Groening had perhaps never visited. The geography of one man's early life, scattered across the world in the names of cartoon characters for 36 years, Portland is still there in Springfield. It always has been. Fact number 28. The show once accidentally placed its own cancellation date in a background prop, and the show then survived that date by more than 2 decades without comment. In a Season 9 episode from 1997, among the background details the art department dropped into a scene to populate the world with texture, there is a printed document or magazine that references the year 2000 inches, a way that implies the show's conclusion. The detail is small and easy to miss, the kind of thing that requires either obsessive attention or fortunate pausing to catch. In 1997, a 2000 end date for a show in its 9th season would not have seemed unreasonable. 9 seasons is a long time for any television show. The Simpsons had already run significantly longer than most animated series aspire to. The show's golden age was, in the estimation of many critics, already beginning to recede. 2 or 3 more years would have seemed like an adequate additional run for something that had already achieved so much. Then 2000 came and went. The show kept going. It kept going through 2002 and 2005 and 2010 and 2015 and 2020 and beyond. Each year, a new, quiet refutation of the accidentally included endpoint. The show outlived its own casually printed cancellation by more than 2 decades and is still in production, approaching its 40th season, making the prop's prediction not just wrong but spectacularly, comprehensively, almost comically wrong. There is a specific quality to accidental immortality of that kind. The show has been around long enough to outlive its own casual expectations about itself. A background art detail dropped into a frame without thought became, in retrospect, a document of how wrong it is possible to be about what will end and when. The prop said 2000. The show said something else, which was that it wasn't finished, and that it wouldn't be finished in 2000 or for a very long time after 2000, and that the question of when it would be finished was not a question that a background prop in Season 9 was equipped to answer. Springfield kept going. It corrected the record by continuing. Fact number 27. Homer Simpson has held somewhere between 188 and 300 distinct occupations during the show's run, depending on how you count, which means he has averaged more than 5 new career changes per year across 3.5 decades. The list is extraordinary in its breadth and its variety. Safety inspector at the nuclear plant, yes, that's the one everyone knows, the one that anchors his professional identity and provides the premise for much of the show's satire. But also astronaut, food critic, country music manager, professional bowler, missionary, Hollywood stuntman, paparazzo, carny, mayor of Springfield, police officer, sanitation commissioner, street musician, dog whisperer, personal trainer, boxing promoter, internet entrepreneur, beer baron, bodyguard for a celebrity, and approximately 180 other things depending on which episodes you include in the count. Under any realistic logic, this is impossible. A man in his mid-30s, with Homer's documented educational background and established history of catastrophic professional failure, could not have held this many jobs. The careers do not build on each other. There is no arc, no progression, no accumulation of expertise or reputation that explains how he keeps getting hired. Homer finishes one episode as a celebrated celebrity chef and returns the following week to Sector 7G as if the previous week's career happened in a different life. He was briefly the most powerful man in Springfield's sanitation infrastructure. He was, for a time, an artist whose sculptures became critically acclaimed. He was the leader of a vigilante group, and then he was back at the plant, eating donuts at his workstation, watching the safety indicator tick toward the red. The coma theory finds this perfectly legible. Homer's dreaming brain cycling through an endless sequence of fantasy versions of a life it doesn't get to live, trying on each career and finding that none of them resolves the essential longing at the dream center, which is simply for the family to be intact and present and real. The jobs are distractions from the fact that the dream goes on and on. No job satisfies because no job is what Homer actually wants. What he wants is the thing the dream already has. The family preserved at the moment he went under, unchanged, still his. The more grounded reading is perhaps the most interesting one. If you average it out, Homer has had more than 5 new career starts per year for 36 years. He has tried more things than most people ever will. He has failed at more things. He has stumbled into brief, improbable moments of genuine success and stumbled back out of each of them, and found himself, every time, back in the same chair, in front of the same control panel, in the same sector of the same plant, in the same town. He has never been able to leave. The plant is the constant. The 188 other jobs are the experiments. Homer is the man who could have been anything, and who is always, eventually, back where he started. Which means the plant is who Homer is, in the sense that home is who you are. The place you always return to, whatever else you try. Fact number 26. The Simpsons opening theme runs at a different length every single week, and the vast majority of viewers have never consciously noticed this because the musical structure was designed to accommodate it from the beginning. Danny Elfman wrote the opening theme in approximately 2 days in 1989, working quickly to meet a production deadline that didn't leave room for an extended compositional process. In those 2 days, working under that constraint, he built something modular. The melody has structural anchor points, recurring phrases that can be extended or contracted without losing their coherence. A musical architecture that breathes with whatever it needs to contain. What it needs to contain changes every week because the couch gag at the end of the opening sequence is different every week, and the couch gag is different lengths every week. Sometimes it runs for 10 seconds. Sometimes it runs for 2 minutes. Some couch gags are single, quick visual jokes. Others are elaborate animated films produced by guest directors that feel more like standalone works than bumpers for a television episode. The theme accommodates all of it. It stretches and compresses around the couch gag without ever sounding incomplete or padded, without ever calling attention to the adjustment it's making. The musical phrasing always resolves. The melody always lands where it needs to land. The theme sounds right, whether it runs short or long, and most viewers, who have watched the opening hundreds of times across their lives, have never registered that the length varies because the variation doesn't announce itself. The couch gag itself has become one of the most artistically varied recurring elements in the history of American television. It has been used to satirize the production conditions of animation outsourcing, to reference political events, to celebrate guest artists brought in from outside the show's usual creative team, to execute genuinely experimental animated filmmaking within the container of a comedy show's opening sequence. Some couch gags are more famous as standalone pieces of animation than many of the episodes they introduce. Elfman built a flexible musical container for all of that in 2 days, in 1989, for a show that nobody at the time expected to still be running a decade later, let alone 4 decades later, let alone long enough that the flexibility he built into the structure would be used to accommodate experimental animation produced by artists who were children when he wrote the theme. The theme adjusts. It has been adjusting since 1989. Nobody notices because the adjustment is perfect. That's the whole trick. Before we continue, if you're still here and comfortable, leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I genuinely like knowing. And if this kind of company is useful to you, subscribe. There's more coming. Section 2, Facts 25 through 21 tier, oddly specific. The facts in this section exist in a particular category. Each of them represents a deliberate choice, a specific decision made by a specific person or room full of people, approved and animated and broadcast to millions. Most of those millions filed the result under funny cartoon stuff without knowing how much thought had gone into it. These are facts about caring. About people expending effort on specific things when nobody required them to care that carefully about those specific things. Fact number 25. Mr. Burns has a childhood teddy bear named Bobo, and Bobo has a more extensively documented personal history than most characters who have appeared in multiple seasons of the show. In Season 5's Rosebud, widely considered one of the finest single episodes the show ever produced, it is revealed that Charles Montgomery Burns, the richest and most dangerous man in Springfield, the man who has outlived everyone who ever knew him, who manipulates mayors and senators with the casual ease of a person moving objects on a desk, has been separated from his childhood teddy bear for the better part of a century and has spent that time missing it. The bear's name is Bobo. It has one button eye. It was Burns's companion when he was small, before the day he made the choice that defined the rest of his life, the choice to leave his ordinary, affectionate family and pursue wealth and power. When he left Bobo behind, the way you leave behind everything soft when you go looking for what he went looking for. Not in a single dramatic moment. In the quiet accumulation of choices that took him further and further from what he'd been, the episode traces the bear's journey through the 20th century. From Burns's childhood home forward through the decades, the bear passes through a succession of strangers' hands. It ends up, at one point, in Adolf Hitler's possession in a bunker, and the image of Hitler clutching this stuffed bear with the button eye, the same bear a lonely child in Springfield misses, is one of those moments where the show's absurdism and its genuine emotional intelligence occupy the same frame simultaneously. The bear moves on. It washes up somewhere. It is found by a drifter who carries it for reasons they cannot fully explain, some residual warmth in the thing that the century of separation hasn't managed to drain out of it. The episode is structured as a clear riff on Citizen Kane. Bobo is Rosebud, Burns is Kane. The point in Cain is that a man's greatness and his essential smallness are the same thing, that the empire is compensation for the loss of something that can never be recovered. The Simpsons version goes somewhere Cain doesn't quite reach. In Cain, Rosebud is a private symbol of innocence that no one else can access or understand. In Rosebud, Bobo has been circulating through the world doing actual good, warming the hands of strangers who needed it, carrying comfort it didn't know it was carrying, being more useful in the world as a lost object than it would have been as a possessed one. Burns gets the bear back at the end. The final image is him in his enormous bed, in his enormous house, holding a stuffed toy with a button eye, with a century of wrong choices pressing down on him from all sides, and looking, for a moment, like the child he was when the choices began. The most dangerous man in Springfield reduced to his beginning. The bear has a better character arc than most characters who have appeared in the show for multiple seasons. It's a stuffed toy with no dialogue and one button eye, and it's the emotional center of one of the finest hours American television comedy has ever produced. Fact number 24. Lisa Simpson's saxophone was chosen after a deliberate creative discussion about what instrument could carry the specific emotional register her character required, and the choice was more thoughtful than it has generally been given credit for. In the early development of the full-length series, significant attention was paid to defining what each member of the Simpson family represented in terms of their function within the story's emotional architecture. Homer was ambition and failure and love, all running in different directions at once. Marge was patience and suppressed complexity, a person who contained more than she was given room to express. Bart was transgression with joy at its center. Maggie was potential, still and watching. And Lisa was something that required a specific instrument to give voice to. The saxophone occupies a unique position in American musical tradition. It is relatively young by classical standards, invented in the 1840s, adopted into jazz and blues in the early 20th century in ways that gave it a specific emotional vocabulary that no older instrument had developed. The saxophone, played by someone who understands what it can do, sounds like longing given breath. It sounds like reaching. It has a human quality, a closeness to the sound of a throat and a voice and a feeling working through them that makes it carry emotional weight in a way that the violin or the piano, for all their expressiveness, don't quite replicate. When Lisa plays, particularly in the quieter and more interior moments the show has built around her, the saxophone communicates something that the dialogue doesn't need to say alongside it. She is 8 years old and she feels everything at a volume the world around her can't accommodate. She is the smartest person in most of the rooms she enters and has not yet learned whether intelligence is a gift or a burden or both simultaneously. The saxophone is the instrument for that specific condition, the reach without a rival, the expression that doesn't resolve. The recurring image the show uses of Lisa playing alone, usually after something has gone wrong that she understood was going wrong before it went wrong and was unable to prevent, is one of the show's most carefully deployed visual gestures. The camera lingers on it longer than comedy usually permits. The music becomes something spare and personal. The neighborhood exists in the background, going about its business, indifferent to what she's processing. And Lisa keeps playing into the indifference, which is the thing the show wants you to understand about her most. Not that she's sad, not only that she keeps going. Not because it helps, because it's what she has. The saxophone wasn't a random creative choice. It was the result of people thinking carefully about what an instrument could say about a character that the character herself might not yet have the language to say out loud. 36 years of episodes later, the choice still holds. Fact number 23. The Simpsons movie contains 38 seconds of complete silence placed there deliberately, in a medium where silence is almost always treated as a technical failure rather than a creative choice. The Simpsons movie, released in 2007 after a development process involving multiple complete rewrites and years of the kind of revision that characterizes productions where everyone involved cares too much to let anything through that isn't right, runs at approximately 97 minutes. Within that runtime, director David Silverman placed a sequence of 38 seconds in which no dialogue plays, no music plays, and no meaningful sound effects play. The audio track is essentially empty. What you hear is the presence of silence, and what you see is an exchange between Homer and Marge that communicates entirely through what the animation shows you without telling you how to feel about it. In animated film production, silence is almost always filled. The industry's strong default is to have something in the audio track at all times, because the conventional wisdom holds that audiences interpret silence as error in animation, that an empty audio track registers as a technical problem rather than a deliberate artistic choice. The confidence required to leave 38 consecutive seconds of a major theatrical release in silence is not a small thing. It is a bet on the audience's willingness to stay with a scene that isn't giving them audio cues about how to respond. Silverman's bet was that 36 years of knowing these two people would make the silence legible, that the audience would understand what was happening between Homer and Marge through the animation alone, through the way their faces are arranged, and the distance between their bodies and the specific quality of stillness the scene has, without needing music to tell them this is a sad moment or dialogue to explain what each character is feeling. He trusted that the accumulated weight of everything that had happened between these two people across 36 seasons would do the work that the audio track was not doing. The bet paid off. The silence lands. The scene is consistently cited as one of the most emotionally effective sequences in the film, which contains several strong candidates for that distinction. What makes it work is precisely the absence of scaffolding. The sense that what's happening between Homer and Marge exists at a level below language, below music, below even the score telling you how to feel. You encounter it directly, without mediation, the way you encounter something in a real relationship that can't be talked around. The show spent 19 years making its audience expect noise, conditioning them to the rhythm of Homer's voice and Marge's worried hum and Bart's escalating provocations. And then the film used that conditioning to make 38 seconds of nothing feel like the loudest moment in the whole production. Fact number 22. The same background characters appear unchanged in Springfield scenes, spanning different historical eras, which means that within the show's own logic, these figures have been present in Springfield across decades without aging, and no one has acknowledged this. This is the kind of detail that rewards the particular kind of attention that comes from watching the same show many times across many years. In a flashback sequence set in 1969, in a crowd scene at a public event, there is a figure in the background with a specific face and a specific set of visual characteristics. In an episode set in 1995, the same figure appears in a different crowd scene, in a different context, with the same face and the same apparent age. In a more recent episode, they are there again, in the background of yet another public gathering, unchanged across 26 years of depicted time. The explanation is straightforward and practical. The show's art department developed a library of background character designs over the decades, a set of faces and body types and clothing combinations that could be deployed into crowd scenes as needed, populating the town with the visual texture of a human community without requiring the time and expense of designing unique individuals for every background position in every scene. The library was deep enough to create visual variety, while being efficient enough to reuse across many episodes. The result, examined closely across the show's run, is that Springfield contains a population of background figures who do not age alongside the depicted history of the town. Not the main cast, who don't age for reasons the show has constructed extensive frameworks to explain or ignore, but the people in the background, the ones nobody was designed to look at carefully. They were production shortcuts that became, under sustained attention, something stranger. Under the radiation theory, this reads as data. The biological stasis that affects the Simpson family extends to the general population. Springfield's contaminated environment has altered something at a cellular level for everyone who lives there, not only the people the story follows. The background extras don't age because nobody in Springfield ages. The characters we know and the characters we don't, the named and the unnamed, the centered and the peripheral. The mutation is town-wide. Under the coma theory, the background extras are props. Homer's dreaming brain doesn't invest creative energy in the people standing in the background of his dream. It populates them with recurring figures from memory, the same compressed impressions of human presence appearing in different contexts, because the dream isn't bothering to generate new faces for positions that don't serve the narrative. The background of Springfield is the background of Homer's memory, populated by recycled fragments of the people he half noticed throughout his life. Either way, the figures in the background of Springfield have been standing there, unchanged, since the show began, watching everything happen, appearing in historical periods they couldn't logically have lived through at the age they appear to be. Springfield's permanent witnesses. Nobody has ever asked them how they're doing. Fact number 21. The Simpsons writing staff has included multiple people with advanced degrees in mathematics and physics whose technical work appears correctly in background, details that the overwhelming majority of viewers have had no way to verify or even notice. The show's Ivy League pedigree shows up in places that are genuinely unexpected, given that the show is a primetime animated comedy aimed at a broad audience whose engagement with it is primarily emotional rather than analytical. But the Harvard and Yale graduates who have cycled through the writing room across the show's history did not leave their technical training outside when they came in. They brought it with them. It shows up in background equations, in passing references, in the specific accuracy of scientific and mathematical concepts that appear in episodes and are treated by the scripts as given rather than established. Equations on chalkboards in scenes featuring Homer at work or Lisa at school have been checked for mathematical accuracy by people who are genuinely capable of performing that check. The accuracy isn't required by the comedy. The joke works regardless of whether the equation is right or wrong. A correct equation in the background of a scene involving Homer pretending to do real work is visible to approximately 0% of the viewing audience in real time. It is the kind of detail that can only be appreciated by someone who has the mathematical background to evaluate it, and the patience to pause the episode and look at it. But it's correct, because the person who wrote it was the kind of person for whom writing it correctly was a matter of personal standard, independent of whether anyone would ever notice. The Latin in the show, when it appears in inscriptions and formal contexts, has been checked against classical grammar. The legal terminology that appears in Springfield's courtroom scenes sometimes reflects genuine procedural accuracy rather than invented plausibility. The statistical concepts that appear in Lisa's academic storylines are sometimes actually correct in ways that the comedy doesn't require. This is a specific kind of caring that expends real effort on accuracy that will mostly go unseen. The writers were making something that met their own standards, not merely the standards imposed by the requirement to entertain a broad audience. They were holding themselves to a bar that the audience would never be able to observe them clearing. That kind of private standard, maintained inside a weekly comedy cartoon across decades, is its own statement about the nature of the show and the nature of the people who made it. Section 3. Facts 20 through 16, tier, genuinely weird. The territory changes here. The facts in this section don't have the comfortable distance of the earlier ones. They require a slightly different kind of attention, not alarm, nothing quite that close. But they have a quality that resists clean filing. You hear them, and something in the back of your mind registers a slight resistance, a small friction between the fact and the place you'd normally put it. They're the kind of thing that surfaces again later. Fact number 20. Homer Simpson was originally conceived as a character whose role was more functionally expendable than the character the show eventually built. And the Homer we know only exists because the show took time to discover what he actually was. In the earliest development of The Simpsons as a series of animated shorts on The Tracy Ullman Show, and in the initial conversations about bringing it forward to full-length episodes, Homer occupied a different position in the show's architecture than the one he would come to inhabit. He was being conceived as a broadly comedic figure in the classic tradition of the American sitcom, a device for generating situational chaos rather than a subject of genuine emotional investment. He was a mechanism, not a person, in the beginning, a collection of comedic qualities assembled in the shape of a suburban American man and set up to fail in ways that would be funny to watch. The version of Homer in the earliest documents was louder, cruder, more purely a vehicle for misfortune. He didn't have the emotional complexity that would become the show's most enduring achievement, the quality that makes Homer genuinely moving at his best moments. He was being positioned as the kind of character you laugh at, rather than the kind of character you laugh at and then feel unexpectedly tender about in the same scene, which is a very different thing. What happened between those early documents and the Homer, who would eventually become one of the most beloved characters in the history of American television, was a process of discovery, rather than a process of execution. The voice performers found things in the characters that the initial conception hadn't planned for. Dan Castellaneta, finding Homer's voice through repeated recording sessions, discovered that the character could carry more than comedy, that he could be genuinely hurt, not just comically inconvenienced, that he had a specific quality of vulnerability underneath the bluster that, when it appeared, produced something different in the audience than laughter alone. The writers noticed this too and began to write toward it rather than away from it. Homer started to become someone who could miss his mother in a way that registered as real loss. Someone who could be terrified that his children didn't love him. Someone who wanted things that his own limitations prevented him from having, and who kept wanting them anyway, and who kept trying anyway, and who kept being Homer anyway. The Homer of the later early seasons, seasons 3 through 8 in particular, contains depths that the writers were finding in real time, not executing from a blueprint. The character who emerged from that process is the one the world knows. But the process was real, and the earliest episodes, watched closely, show the seams of a character being assembled across 20 or 30 outings before he becomes fully himself. The early Homer is almost but not quite Homer. The real Homer arrived gradually, through the repeated act of smart people paying close attention to who he was turning out to be. Fact number 19. Springfield has been substantially destroyed or severely damaged over 40 separate times across the show's run, and has been fully restored to its default state without explanation in every single case. The list is remarkable in its breadth. The town has been buried under catastrophic snowfall on multiple occasions and dug out without comment by the next episode. It has flooded, it has burned. Various diseases and infestations have swept through it at a level that would constitute civic emergencies in any real community. It has been the site of riots that left visible structural damage to public buildings and private property. A segment of its population was once radicalized by a charismatic stranger into behavior that should have had legal and social consequences lasting years. The Dome. The town was sealed under a federal containment dome in the movie and was back to normal before the following season's premiere. Each time, without exception, the following episode opens on the same Springfield, standing and functional, with no reference to the previous week's catastrophe. The writers have always been aware of this reset button and have treated it variously across the show's history, sometimes making it the subject of jokes, sometimes ignoring it entirely, sometimes building episodes that seem to be specifically about Springfield's inability to retain memory of its own history. The show has been conscious of the mechanism it relies on. It has just relied on it anyway. The cumulative weight of 40-plus destructions and 40-plus restorations creates a quality that is different from the individual instances that compose it. Each individual reset is a production convenience. Assembled across decades, the pattern becomes evidence of something about the town itself, its relationship with consequence, its immunity to the kind of permanent change that accumulates in real communities when real things happen to them. Real towns remember their disasters. They carry them in the landscape, in the architecture that replaced what was destroyed, in the stories passed between people who were there and people who came after. A flood leaves marks on buildings and on the people who watched it. A fire leaves a lot where something stood. Real communities accrete their history whether they want to or not. Springfield discards it, every time. And the 40-plus discards add up to a portrait of a place that doesn't just forget catastrophe but is constitutionally structured to forget it, a place whose relationship with its own past is so attenuated that the concept of permanent consequence doesn't apply. That's not a production convenience anymore. At 40 instances. That's a characteristic. Springfield is the place where things happen and are then undone. That's not a bug in the show's logic. It's the logic itself. Fact number 18. Nancy Cartwright has voiced Bart Simpson continuously. Since 1987, which represents one of the longest continuous performances of a single character in the history of American entertainment, and the technical specifics of what she does have almost never been discussed in proportion to their actual difficulty, 37 years. Beginning with the Tracy Ullman shorts in 1987 and continuing through every season of the main series to the present, Nancy Cartwright has performed as Bart Simpson more or less continuously. The duration alone places the performance in a category with very few parallels in the history of the medium. There are actors who have stayed with roles for a long time. There are voice performers who have maintained characters across extended production runs. But the combination of duration, volume of output, and the specific technical challenge at the center of the work makes this performance exceptional. The challenge is this. Cartwright is maintaining the voice of a 10-year-old boy while she herself ages through her 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s. A purely technical approach, holding the same pitch and timbre through vocal discipline across 4 decades, would eventually produce something mechanical, increasingly an impression rather than a person. The voice would maintain its surface qualities while losing the quality of aliveness that makes a performance feel inhabited rather than performed. What Cartwright has done instead is something subtler and more demanding. She has maintained the essential signature of the voice while allowing her understanding of the character to develop in the same way that an actor's understanding deepens over time. The voice in the more recent seasons is recognizably Bart's voice, but there is more in it, more history, more of the specific texture of a person the performer has been inside for nearly 4 decades, more capacity to carry emotional weight when the material requires it, without losing the irreverence that is Bart's default register. Cartwright has said in public interviews across the years that she thinks of Bart as real. Not literally, obviously, but with the specific quality of intimacy that performers develop for characters they've inhabited long enough that the character has become part of the furniture of their own identity. She knows how Bart would respond to things she hasn't been given scripts for. She has an intuitive sense of what he would and wouldn't do that goes beyond any character description. She knows him the way you know people you've spent decades close to. 4 decades of being a person you're not is a particular kind of life. Most actors who describe long-running roles describe a complicated relationship with the character, a mixture of affection and distance, the need to step away, and the difficulty of fully doing so. Cartwright has described Bart as something she doesn't want to step away from, as a way of being that she's inhabited so completely that the inhabiting is now simply part of who she is. The show ends partly when she decides she's done. 37 years in, she hasn't decided that. Fact number 17. Homer's Enemy was the most internally controversial episode produced during the show's classic era. And the argument was not about darkness, but about what the episode was saying about the show's central character and whether the show could afford to say it. Season 8's episode, Homer's Enemy, introduces Frank Grimes, a character who has worked hard his entire life, overcome genuine adversity, developed legitimate professional skills, and arrived at the Springfield nuclear plant to find that the most celebrated member of the department is Homer Simpson, who has none of the things Frank Grimes has, and who has everything Frank Grimes doesn't have, and who got it all without deserving any of it by any standard that Frank Grimes can apply. The episode is dark. It doesn't arrive with the texture of darkness because it's presented in the show's familiar comedic register with the show's familiar visual style and familiar characters. But what's happening in it is dark. Frank Grimes is being destroyed by the encounter with Homer's existence. He is being driven to the edge of his sanity by the simple fact that a man like Homer gets to have a life like Homer's, and that the world has arranged itself in a way that rewards Homer's failures and punishes Grimes's successes. He cannot make the world make sense in a way that includes this fact. He tries. The effort costs him everything. He dies. Imitating Homer's behavior as a way of demonstrating its absurdity to the room, he electrocutes himself and dies. At his funeral, Homer falls asleep and dreams aloud, and the congregation laughs, and the episode ends, not with resolution. With Homer having the last laugh, literally without even knowing he's having it. The argument the episode generated in the writer's room was not about the appropriateness of the ending or the darkness of the premise. The argument was about what the episode was doing to Homer, whether by placing a realistic observer inside Springfield, someone who responds to Homer the way a real, logical person would respond. The episode was implicitly acknowledging that Homer's life is unjust, that he has more than he deserves and has gotten it through incompetence and luck rather than merit. And whether making that argument, even in comedic tragedy, was doing damage to the 7 seasons the show had invested in asking its audience to love this man. The counter-argument was that the episode was honest in a way the show needed to be honest, that the premise of Homer's charmed and undeserved life had always rested on the audience's generosity, and that acknowledging this through a character who couldn't extend that generosity was artistically courageous rather than damaging. That the show was strong enough to hold the tension between what Homer deserves and what Homer gets without collapsing under the weight of it. The episode aired. 30 years later, the argument hasn't been resolved. because the tension at its center was never meant to resolve. The show decided it could carry that tension. The fact that it has been carrying it since 1997 without collapsing is its own answer to the question the argument was asking. Fact number 16. The Simpsons has twice depicted its own characters rendered with more realistic human proportions, and both times the result has been experienced by viewers as unsettling rather than corrective, which reveals something about the nature of the characters' familiar distortions. In two separate sequences across the show's history, the opening or a special segment has been reimagined with the Simpson family depicted using more conventionally realistic human anatomy. The eyes are normally proportioned. The head shapes approximate human biology. The specific geometries of the characters' features, the overbites and the bulging eyes and the impossible hair, are adjusted towards something closer to what a family of their description would actually look like if they existed in the real world. The audience response to these sequences has been consistent in a specific direction. Viewers describe them as unsettling, not as corrections, not as improvements, as disturbances of something that had been right. The realistic versions of the characters feel wrong in a way that the familiar cartoon versions do not, and this feeling persists across different viewers and different contexts, suggesting it is not purely individual or subjective. What this response tells you is something about how the show's visual language has embedded itself across decades of watching. The cartoon proportions of Springfield's residents are not registered by people who have watched the show for any significant amount of time as deviations from normal human anatomy. They are registered as the characters themselves. The specific shape of Homer's head, which has no correspondence in actual human biology, is simply Homer's head. It is the correct shape for the person it belongs to. When you adjust it toward the realistic, you do not make him look more real. You make him look like someone who is not Homer. This connects to the radiation theory's most persistent argument. If the visual style of Springfield's residents is not a design convention imposed by animation, but a depiction of what the town's contaminated environment has actually done to their bodies, then the realistic versions are not corrections. They're portraits of people who no longer exist, the people Springfield's residents would have been if nothing had happened to them. The cartoon proportions are what they actually look like now. The realistic versions are what they might have been. The discomfort is recognition. The cartoon is home. The realistic version is a stranger wearing a familiar name, and after 36 years, home has taken such a specific shape that anything else feels wrong. Section 4. Facts 15 through 11 tier. Hard to explain. The facts in this section each have explanations. Good ones, reasonable ones, ones that hold up to examination. But each explanation also leaves a small remainder, a residue of strangeness that the explanation absorbs on first hearing, and then deposits back quietly, later, when you're not looking directly at it. These are the facts that return. Fact number 15, every single episode title in the shows. Nearly 800, episode history has been a reference, a parody, or a specific riff on something external, and the show has never once drawn attention to this practice or explained it to its audience. Not a single episode of The Simpsons has a title that is simply a neutral description of its contents. Every title is doing something else simultaneously, referencing a film or book, punning on a phrase from cultural or political history, invoking a piece of academic discourse, riffing on a musical reference that the general audience may or may not recognize, working a joke into the title that rewards the person who catches it and costs nothing for the person who doesn't. The range of references is extraordinary. Last Exit to Springfield names itself after Hubert Selby Jr.'s novel Last Exit to Brooklyn, a work of transgressive American realism about people at society's margins. The episode it titles concerns a union dispute at the nuclear plant, Homer's accidental rise to labor leadership, and the show's satirical treatment of corporate power versus collective action. The Selby reference is not immediately obvious to most viewers, but it's there, connecting the episode to a tradition of American writing about the working class that the show is participating in even while parodying it. Rosebud invokes Citizen Kane directly and earns the invocation. Homer the Heretic reaches into the theological tradition's treatment of religious dissent and applies it to a man who simply stops wanting to go to church on Sunday mornings. A Fish Called Selma riffs on the film A Fish Called Wanda. Homer Badman processes the tabloid media culture of the early 1990s through a frame borrowed from the language of exploitation. Film? The titles reach across the entirety of Western cultural production and find references in virtually every corner of it. A substantial portion of the episode titles reference material that a mass entertainment audience would have no particular reason to recognize. Academic papers, obscure film history, regional literary traditions, political speeches from the distant past. The writers were not putting these references in to be recognized by the general audience. They were putting them in because they were the kind of people who processed their experience through the accumulated library of everything they'd read and watched and thought about, who were incapable of naming something without the name carrying weight beyond the description. The references were for themselves. The title as a primary description was for everyone else. The show ran both channels simultaneously for 800 episodes, and most viewers who watched every single episode have no idea the secondary channel was operating throughout. The writers were always also talking to each other, across episodes, across seasons, in the titles of the things they made. Fact number 14. Sideshow Bob has made 10 separate documented attempts to murder. Bart Simpson has been apprehended and convicted after each one, and has been released back into Springfield after each conviction, and nobody in the show's universe has ever noted the pattern. The mathematics of the Sideshow Bob situation are, if you assemble them and look at them directly, genuinely alarming. Kelsey Grammer has voiced the character since 1990. Across the episodes in which Bob appears, spanning the show's entire run, he has planned, initiated, and failed at 10 separate murder attempts targeting the same 10-year-old child. Each failure has been followed by arrest, prosecution, conviction, imprisonment, and eventually release, which has been followed in turn by another murder attempt. The Springfield legal system that produces this cycle operates at a level of procedural incompetence so comprehensive and consistent that it constitutes a stable feature of the town's civic environment rather than a failure mode of it. Chief Wiggum's department, the courts, the corrections system, all of them are overmatched by even minimal criminal sophistication, and Sideshow Bob is not a minimally sophisticated criminal. He is, as the show has repeatedly established, a man of considerable intelligence and genuine culture who has oriented most of that intelligence toward the goal of killing a child. He holds responsible for the professional humiliation that destroyed his career. He has escaped from multiple secure facilities. He has traveled internationally in pursuit of his vendetta. He has been presumed dead on more than one occasion and returned. He has acquired professional qualifications in multiple fields specifically to construct better murder attempts. By every relevant measure, the Springfield legal system has failed 10 times to impose a consequence sufficient to interrupt this pattern. But the deeper strangeness is not in the legal system's incompetence, which is established and expected. The deeper strangeness is that nobody, across 10 cycles, has noted the pattern publicly. No Springfield newspaper has run an investigative piece about the recidivist who keeps targeting the same child. No advocacy organization has emerged to argue for intervention. No citizen has stood up at a town meeting and said that the system that keeps releasing this man needs to be examined. The pattern exists in front of everyone and is collectively not noticed. Springfield has agreed not to find this remarkable. The cycle of Bob's imprisonment and return is absorbed into the background of town life, the way the cracked cooling towers and the three-eyed fish and the billionaire who remembers the Spanish-American War are absorbed. It is simply how things are around here. Springfield's capacity for collective non-noticing extends to a cycle of attempted murder that has run for 36 years. Bart has survived 10 murder attempts from the same brilliant, obsessive villain. He is still 10 years old. He shows no apparent ongoing psychological consequences. He is, in this as in everything, fine, because Springfield has agreed that he should be fine, and in Springfield what the town agrees upon becomes real. Fact number 13. The core voice cast has produced something in the range of 600 combined years of service to this single show, and every member of that cast has, at some point, described their characters in terms that go beyond professional identification. 6 performers have anchored The Simpsons across its run. The combined total of their years of service to the show, if you add up each person's contribution from their first appearance through the present, is somewhere in the range of 500 to 600 years, varying depending on how you count recurring versus regular appearances. No equivalent number exists for any other core ensemble in American television history. What is notable, beyond the simple duration, is how consistently each of these performers has articulated something beyond the professional when asked to describe their relationship with the roles they've been playing for decades. The answers don't sound like actors talking about long-running characters. They sound like people talking about people they know and care about in a specific, invested, non-professional way. Yeardley Smith, who voices Lisa, has spoken about the character with an intimacy that is striking in interviews, describing Lisa as someone she has a genuine relationship with rather than a role she performs. She has talked about Lisa's loneliness and Lisa's determination and Lisa's specific kind of intelligence as things she understands from the inside, not as qualities she observes from outside and renders in performance. The character and the performer have been in close enough proximity for long enough that the boundary between understanding a character and being shaped by inhabiting them has become unclear. Dan Castellaneta has described Homer in terms of personal identification that go beyond craft, speaking about Homer's anxieties and Homer's love for his family as things that have a resonance in his own life. Things the performance brings him into contact with rather than things he approaches from a safe, analytical distance. These performers are not pretending. 30-plus years of daily or weekly proximity to a character produces knowledge that cannot be produced any other way. They know these people in the specific way you know people you've spent decades close to, with an intuitive understanding of what they would do in situations you haven't been given scripts for, and a genuine investment in their welfare that is not entirely within the performer's control anymore. The show ends when the cast decides they're done. 36 years in, they have not decided that. Fact number 12. There is an episode of The Simpsons that was banned in a foreign market for reasons, rooted in political and historical sensitivities, that the American production team was not aware. They were touching. The Simpsons was built with a specific creative ambition to function as a universal American experience, a show that could feel familiar to viewers across all regions and backgrounds because Springfield was designed to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The show was meant to transcend regional specificity within the United States and, as it became a global phenomenon, to translate its emotional and comedic core into markets with very different cultural contexts. This ambition worked brilliantly within the parameters it was designed for. The show became one of the most widely distributed pieces of American entertainment in history, dubbed and subtitled into dozens of languages, watched in countries where the specific cultural references were unfamiliar, but the texture of family life and civic dysfunction and individual aspiration translated across cultural distance. But the universality had limits that only became visible when the show exported past them. A background detail in an episode, a map or a graphic or a territorial label, treated as throwaway visual texture by the American production team, arrived in a market that had a specific historical and political relationship to that geographic representation. What had been background noise in one cultural context became signal in another. What had been a detail nobody was meant to notice became something that an entire national government chose to respond to formally. The episode was pulled from that market. The production handled it as an innocent error, a consequence of the inevitable inadequacy of a team working in one cultural context and distributing to contexts it did not fully understand. The receiving country handled it differently. What the incident reveals is the specific nature of the show's universality. Springfield works as a universal American setting because it is built from American assumptions, which are invisible from inside and visible from outside. The show is transparent to its own cultural premises exactly because those premises are the water it swims in. Export it past those premises and the water becomes visible, and what looked like no particular place reveals itself as a very particular place, one that carries very particular assumptions about which parts of the world are background and which parts are story. Fact number 11. The Simpsons has had a measurable, documentable effect on public attitudes toward nuclear energy that has been studied in peer-reviewed research and found to be statistically significant and persistent across decades. Multiple academic studies, conducted across different national contexts and using different methodological approaches, have examined the relationship between exposure to The Simpsons and attitudes toward nuclear energy. The findings, when assembled, point in a consistent direction. People with high Simpsons exposure and without significant countervailing education or experience demonstrate measurably different attitudes toward nuclear power plant safety, nuclear risk, and nuclear energy in general than comparable populations with lower exposure. The effect is real. It has been quantified. It is comparable in some studies to the effect of actual negative news coverage of nuclear incidents. A primetime animated comedy about a fictional family in a fictional town has produced lasting attitudinal effects toward a real energy technology in real people, effects that persist across years and that have influenced real energy policy debates in real national political contexts. The show never sought this outcome. Burns is a villain because the show needed a compelling villain, and a billionaire owner of a criminally mismanaged nuclear facility was a satisfying fit for the kind of corporate villainy the early seasons were built around. Homer is an incompetent safety inspector because the character's specific type of lovable ineptitude found a perfect structural home in a role that should require exactly the competencies he most spectacularly lacks. The three-eyed fish was a sight gag. The plutonium paperweight was a quick joke. The cracked cooling towers patched with chewing gum were images chosen for their comedy value. The comedy value was delivered. The images also embedded themselves in the audience's cognitive model of what a nuclear power plant is and what nuclear energy means, and that embedding happened early enough and broadly enough in the show's run that it has proven, decades later, resistant to revision. Most works of fiction don't do this. Most fiction, however broadly watched, doesn't produce measurable attitudinal effects toward real-world phenomena that persist in the audience decades after viewing. The Simpsons achieved this outcome not through any particular intention, but through the specific combination of the imagery it chose, the breadth of its distribution, the depth of its cultural penetration, and the duration of its run. Fiction shapes perception. When fiction runs long enough and reaches broadly enough, the shaping is lasting. The three-eyed fish is still swimming in people's mental model of what nuclear power does. It has been swimming there for 36 years. Section 5. Facts 10. Through 8 tier. Deeply strange. The top 10. These facts sit at a place where the show's extraordinary length, the obsessive documentation of its audience, and the specific strangeness of what happens when a piece of fiction runs long enough to develop its own archaeology all converge. Take your time with each of these. Fact number 10. Krusty the Clown was originally designed to be Homer Simpson in disguise. The reveal was never made, and evidence of the original plan is still visible in the show if you know where to look. Matt Groening has discussed this directly in interviews, with the openness of someone whose relationship to an abandoned plan has become more archaeological than protective. In his original conception of the show as a full-length series, Krusty the Clown was Homer Simpson, living a double life as a beloved entertainer who was adored by his own children without them ever realizing it. The dramatic irony would have been the engine. Homer, dismissed and undervalued at home and in the neighborhood, put on clown makeup, and became the figure Bart and Lisa worshipped above almost everything else, and they would never know it was him. The premise was abandoned before the show went to series because the writers could not construct a sustainable long-term architecture for it. Either the reveal comes eventually, at which point the premise changes fundamentally, and the post-reveal show has to be a different show, or the reveal never comes, and the non-reveal becomes something the audience waits for and resents when it doesn't arrive. Neither path led anywhere the story wanted to go. The idea was retired. The character of Krusty was separated from Homer and became his own person. But the separation was incomplete, or the design remembers what the plan was, even though the plan was abandoned. Krusty and Homer, placed side by side, share a basic body shape. They share a general facial structure. The visual resemblance between them is not subtle and is not incidental. The art design of the show built Krusty as Homer in a way that the story no longer confirms, and the design has been carried forward across 36 seasons because changing it would be more disruptive than maintaining it. More than the visuals, the backstory developed for Krusty across the series rhymes with Homer's backstory in structural ways that feel less like coincidence and more like the echo of a premise that was never completed. Both men have complicated and painful relationships with their fathers. Both men have professional lives that function as compensation for something absent in their personal lives. Both men are genuinely funny and genuinely sad in the specific combination that makes a certain kind of comedy possible, the kind where the laugh and the heartbreak share the same space. The show has made jokes across multiple episodes that seem to reach toward the abandoned premise without committing to it. Moments where Homer and Krusty occupy the same frame and the camera acknowledges the resemblance without the narrative following through. The show is winking at something it decided not to say for 36 years, one episode at a time. The skeleton of the original plan is in the frame. Anyone who knows what they're looking for can still find it. Fact number 9. A background equation in the 1998 episode, The Wizard of Evergreen Terrace, appears to have predicted the mass of the Higgs boson particle 14 years before the discovery was experimentally confirmed at the Large Hadron Collider. In 1998, the episode aired. Homer becomes obsessed with invention, covering chalkboards with work in his garage, and the chalkboards contain equations written by the show's writers and mathematics consultants. The equations were placed in the background of the episode as visual texture, as props that made Homer's obsession look like something genuine, without any intention that they would be examined beyond their function as set dressing. The equations were written by David X. Cohen, a Simpsons writer with a serious background in computer science and mathematics, working with the show's network of scientific and mathematical consultants who had been providing technical grounding for the show's more academically inflected content for years. In 2019, physicist Simon Singh, researching a book about the mathematical content of The Simpsons, examined the equations closely and found that one of them appeared to predict the mass of the Higgs boson particle. The Higgs boson, the particle associated with the field through which other particles acquire mass, was theorized for decades before it was experimentally confirmed in 2012. Through experiments at CERN requiring one of the most complex and expensive scientific projects in human history, Singh was careful. He did not claim the show had genuinely foretold the discovery. The equation is an approximation, not an exact match to the confirmed value, but it is close enough and specific enough in its physical reasoning that it represents something more than coincidence. The person who wrote it understood theoretical physics at a level that allowed them to point in the right direction in 1998 in a background prop in a comedy episode in a way that the experimental apparatus of the scientific community would spend the following 14 years building to verify. The show did not discover the Higgs boson, but a chalkboard in the background of a scene in which Homer pretends to be an inventor was, in some meaningful sense, carrying a correct answer to a question that the scientific world would not officially answer until 2012. Because the person who filled that chalkboard was the kind of person who would write something real there, even when the requirement was only to write something convincing, a physics equation in a background prop, 14 years ahead of the collider that confirmed it. In a scene where the joke is that Homer is pretending to be smarter than he is. Fact number 8. The Simpsons has never ended an episode on a genuine, unambiguous tragedy in 36 years and nearly 800 episodes. And this is not luck or oversight, but a structural commitment that has been maintained through every change in creative staff. Run through the episodes that come closest to the edge. The death of Maud Flanders, sudden and strange, and treated with a particular kind of quiet gravity that feels unlike the show's usual register. The recurring departures of Homer's mother, each return and each goodbye carrying more weight than the previous one. The episode where Homer and Marge come closer to the end of their marriage than the show usually allows itself to go. The episode where Lisa discovers the truth about Jebediah Springfield and chooses to protect the myth rather than destroy it, which is a kind of defeat that the show doesn't soften or redeem. Every single one of these episodes, including the ones that reach furthest into genuine loss, ends somewhere other than pure desolation. Not in resolution, not in the cheap comfort of a fixed problem. Not in the kind of happy ending that requires the audience to accept that the previous 40 minutes resolve something that doesn't resolve that cleanly. The Simpsons is not that kind of show and has never pretended to be. What each of those episodes does instead is find a closing note that contains the sadness without being consumed by it. Homer holds Marge's hand. Lisa plays her saxophone in her room, quietly, for herself. The family sits together in the living room in the low light of an ordinary evening. Not better, not fixed, but together and choosing to stay that way. The credits roll over people who are still a family. The show's producers have articulated this as a structural commitment that the show holds as a matter of principle rather than preference. The Simpson family must, at the end of every episode, still be a family. That is the guarantee the show makes to its audience, and it is the only guarantee the show makes. Everything else, the quality, the tone, the specific direction of any given story, is negotiable. The family being intact at the end is not. This commitment has been held through 36 seasons of staff turnover and tonal drift and cultural change, and 800 episodes produced by thousands of different combinations of writers and animators and directors. It is held because it is the load-bearing wall of the show's architecture. Without it, there is no show to come back to. With it, there is always a show to come back to. 800 episodes. One unbroken guarantee. The couch is always there at the end. Section 6. Facts 7 through 5 tier. Disturbing when you sit with it. These 3 facts look fine on first hearing. They don't announce themselves as disturbing. They arrive quietly, with the surface normality of the facts that preceded them, and they require sitting with before their particular quality becomes apparent. Let them land slowly. Fact number 7. Ralph Wiggum's behavior across the show's entire run is consistent with specific documented clinical profiles in ways that are too precise to be accidental, and Springfield has never addressed this. Ralph Wiggum is beloved. His lines are quoted more frequently than those of most main cast members. Fan communities have cataloged his stranger utterances and shared them with the affection reserved for genuinely loved things. He is understood as a source of pure, gentle, absurdist comedy, the boy who exists slightly outside the consensus reality that everyone else shares, producing responses to situations that seem to come from somewhere else entirely. The clinical reading of Ralph, documented by fans and educators and developmental specialists who watch the show closely, is that his behavior across episodes is not randomly disconnected. It has patterns. Specific, recurring patterns that are too consistent across too many years of writing by too many different writers to be the product of random non-sequitur generation. Ralph demonstrates limited ability to track conversational context, producing responses that suggest he is engaging with a different interaction than the one happening around him. He shows difficulty with spatial reasoning and with social boundaries in ways that are consistent across episodes. He forms attachments to inanimate objects and attributes relational significance to those attachments. He has shown in multiple episodes difficulty distinguishing between things that are happening in the present and things he has imagined or remembered. He responds to cues that aren't present and misses cues that are. The pattern aligns, according to people with backgrounds in child development, with several clinical profiles involving neurodevelopmental differences. The alignment is too specific and too consistent to be accidental. The character has been written with enough internal coherence across decades of different writers to constitute a portrait of a specific kind of mind rather than a collection of random comic observations. The disturbing part is not that Ralph may have a neurodevelopmental difference. The disturbing part is the context in which he exists. His father is the chief of police of a town that operates through systematic non-noticing of inconvenient facts. Whether Chief Wiggum has ever sought any kind of support or assessment for his son is something the show has never addressed. Springfield has watched Ralph for 36 years and agreed not to see what it's seeing. Ralph keeps arriving at school. He keeps talking to inanimate objects and forming conclusions the room hasn't reached. And the town that has agreed not to notice three-eyed fish and a billionaire who glows in the dark and a principal who isn't who he says he is, has agreed, with the same ease, not to notice this. Fact number 6. The Simpsons writing staff once produced an episode that was a direct response to a specific real critical review of the show, and the critic didn't know until after it had already aired. A television critic published a substantial and carefully argued piece claiming the show had entered meaningful decline, identifying specific qualities that had been present in the show's best work, and that the critic argued were now absent. The piece was specific enough to constitute a real engagement with the show's creative history, and it circulated in ways that reached the people making the show. The writing staff read it. They discussed it. They disagreed with it in the one medium available to them. They wrote an episode. The episode was not a rebuttal in any explicit sense. It contained no reference to the critical piece, no acknowledgement of the argument it was engaging with, no signal to the general audience that something specific was being demonstrated. To the vast majority of viewers, it was simply another Simpsons episode. To the writers who made it, it was an argument conducted in the medium itself, a response delivered through the thing being defended. The critic eventually became aware of the episode and of its relationship to the review. The experience is, by multiple accounts, difficult to describe in neutral terms. Being taken seriously enough to generate a television episode in response is a form of recognition. Being responded to at that scale, without forewarning, with no ability to prepare or engage with the response before it aired, is also a form of power differential that the show exercised quietly and without announcement. What the incident reveals is the specific confidence of a writing room that believes in its own work strongly enough to defend it in the most expensive and elaborate way available to a primetime network television show. They didn't issue a statement. They didn't give an interview. They made more television, in the same medium the critic had reviewed, building the response into the work itself, and broadcast it to the audience that had read the criticism. That is a particular kind of assertion. The show exists. It knows what it is. And it will demonstrate what it is in the medium in which it exists, without asking anyone's permission. Fact number 5. There is a scene from The City of New York versus Homer Simpson that was permanently removed from all domestic broadcast versions after September 2001 and has not been restored, creating a small permanent lacuna in the show's archive that most viewers currently encountering the episode don't know is there. The episode's complicated post-September 2001 history is extensively documented. It was pulled from rotation quickly, given its sustained imagery of the World Trade Center as a central location. The decision was made without public debate about whether it was correct, and it was correct, given what had just happened and what the episode contained. What is less documented is the specific editorial change that was made when the episode returned to broadcast. The episode did return. The decision was eventually made that it was a piece of cultural history that should be preserved and accessible, and the towers were not digitally removed. The episode airs with the towers in it. Most of it airs as it originally aired. One scene was cut. It has not been restored in any domestic broadcast version. The content that was removed involves a reference that, in the specific emotional and political context following the attacks, was determined to be impossible to air in any form, regardless of how much time had passed. The edit is clean. The episode runs at a slightly shorter length than its original broadcast. Viewers encountering it for the first time in syndication don't notice the absence because they have no way of knowing what was there. There is a gap in the show's archive, a small one. A moment broadcast once in September 1997, received by its original audience as one element of a comedy episode, and then placed in a state of permanent suppression by the weight of what happened 4 years later, in a city that the episode had been set in. The gap is a document. It marks a place where the floating timeline of Springfield could not float, where the permanent present of the show ran up against a moment in actual time that the reset button could not absorb. The town doesn't reset that scene. The town can't reset that scene. It exists now as an absence in the middle of an episode that is otherwise present, a small permanent marking of a place where the show's normal mechanisms didn't work. Section 7. Facts 4. Through 2-tier. Legitimately unsettling. These 3 facts are what the earlier sections were building toward. Each of them requires the show's full duration to exist. None of them would be possible if the show had ended in 1997 or 2005 or even 2015. They are the product of time, of what happens to a cultural artifact when it runs long enough to accumulate a history it was never designed to carry. Fact number 4. The Simpsons holds the world record for most guest stars of any single television series, and a documentable portion of those guests have died in the years since their appearances, making the show an incidental archive of the famous dead. The number of documented guest appearances by conservative count exceeds 1,400. No other television series in history has featured as many distinctive guest performers. The record is not competitive. The arithmetic of what follows from that number is inevitable. The show began in 1989. Many of its earliest prominent guests were figures who were then in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. In the 36 years since, simple mortality has claimed a significant portion of those early participants. People who appeared in the show's first decade include many who are no longer alive, and each year the list grows longer as the show continues, and as the pool of people who appeared in earlier decades continues to age. George Harrison appeared in a 1995 episode. He died in 2001. The episode preserves a moment in which he was alive and present and doing something for an audience, bringing his specific voice and humor to a medium that could capture and hold it. People return to the episode to hear him. It exists as a record of his being there, at that time, in that frame. The show has accumulated its dead as a side effect of duration, rather than design. It was on long enough to outlive a significant portion of everyone it touched, and the episodes remain, each one a preservation of a moment in which someone who is gone was still here. The archive is not a memorial in any intended sense. Nobody designed it that way. But it functions as one, incidentally, and necessarily, because any document long enough to span the lives of the people it involves eventually becomes a record of mortality as much as a record of anything else. The show has been running since 1989. At some point in the future, it will have outlived everyone who appeared in it. The episodes will remain. The moments will remain inside them. That is what the archive becomes, when the last person who made it is gone. Fact number 3. The Simpsons has depicted every major form of human death across its run, and the episodes containing these depictions are archived alongside every other episode without special categorization, as if the inventory were unremarkable. Working through the show's back catalog with this specific question is a strange exercise that fans have conducted and documented. The question is, across nearly 800 episodes, what ways of dying are not represented? The answer, assembled from the documented record, is almost none. Characters in the show's universe have drowned, burned, been crushed, fallen from significant heights, been electrocuted, died of disease, died of old age, died of violence that was intended and violence that was accidental, died of a comprehensive range of more exotic causes that the show's writers found uses for across 3.5 decades of weekly comedy production. Most of these deaths happen to minor or background characters. Hans Moleman dies in canonical episodes with a frequency that places him, by the count of fans who have done the work, among the most frequently killed characters in American animation history. He returns without explanation each time and accepts the next death without apparent concern. The accumulation of his deaths, counted across the show's run, is a number most fans prefer not to calculate. What is notable is not the individual deaths, each of which is justified within its own episode. It is the range, the comprehensiveness, the sense, when you assemble the inventory, that the show's extraordinary length has allowed it to cover the full catalog of human mortality, one comedic death at a time, without ever intending to compose such a catalog, without anyone standing back to take its measure. The catalog exists. Nobody planned it. The show was simply on long enough for it to accumulate, one episode at a time, across decades. A comprehensive inventory of the ways a body can fail, assembled across the longest-running animated show in television history, filed without special note alongside hundreds of other episodes. Fact number 2. The Simpsons is the only piece of American popular entertainment that has maintained continuous narrative presence in American culture for the entire lifetime of a significant portion of its current living audience. And this relationship between a story and the people who grew up alongside it has no historical parallel in the medium. People who are 36 years old have been alive for approximately the same amount of time that The Simpsons has been on television. They have never known a world without it. It existed before their conscious memory began. It was a presence in their early experience, something that happened at a certain time of the week, that the adults around them watched and that they watched alongside those adults and then alone as they grew old enough to make their own choices about what to watch. The show was there through childhood, it was there through adolescence, through whatever years that meant, through early adulthood, through whatever form adulthood has taken for each person currently watching. It is still there now. This specific relationship between a single continuing piece of fiction and the entire span of a living generation's development from infancy through adulthood has no parallel in the history of American popular entertainment. Books can achieve something like it across generations that pass the same books down. Myths achieve it on timescales longer than individual lives. But in the medium of television, In American popular entertainment specifically, there is nothing else. People who grew up with this show did not grow up with it the way they grew up with other television shows, which ended and were replaced by other things. They grew up with it the way they grew up with places they knew well, with neighborhoods and houses and streets that formed the geography of their early life. Springfield has been a fixture of their reality in the same way that the places of childhood are fixtures, present in memory in ways that are not entirely available to conscious examination, built into the architecture of how they understand certain things. The family on screen didn't age while all of this was happening. Homer stayed in his mid-30s. Marge kept her impossible hair. Bart stayed 10. Lisa stayed 8. Maggie held her pacifier. The audience aged through childhood and adolescence and early adulthood, and the show watched from the other side of the screen, unchanging, a fixed point against which the passage of time in the viewer's own lives was silently measured. There is no category in television history for this. The Simpsons didn't just accompany a generation. It accompanied a generation through its entire formation into adults, without interruption, without cancellation, without ending. And it is still there now that those adults are adults, which means the relationship is still ongoing, which means it is still accumulating. That is the second wildest fact about this show. The wildest is still ahead. Interlude the golden age and the question nobody can agree on. When did The Simpsons peak, and does the answer even matter? There is a debate that has been running in parallel with The Simpsons itself for almost as long as the show has been on the air. It is not a debate about any single episode, not a dispute about a particular character or plotline or creative decision. It is a larger, more philosophical argument, one of those arguments that never quite resolves, because the people having it are not quite arguing about the same thing, even when they think they are. The debate is this: when was The Simpsons at its best? Ask 10 people this question, and you will get, at most, 3 or 4 clusters of answer. The first cluster, the most common, the most cited, the one that forms the backbone of most critical assessments of the show, is seasons 3 through 8. This is the period that most fans of a certain vintage consider definitively golden, a stretch of roughly 5 years during the early to mid-1990s when the show was producing, week after week, some of the densest and most carefully constructed comedy television had ever seen. The episodes from this period are the ones that get quoted most readily. Cape Fear, Homer Goes to College, Marge versus The Monorail, Last Exit to Springfield, Homer's Phobia, You Only Move Twice. These are episodes that have been analyzed in books, in academic papers, in podcast episodes lasting 3 hours, in YouTube video essays that themselves stretch past the hour mark. They are studied not just as good television, but as examples of comedy writing operating at or near its theoretical ceiling. The reason these episodes hold up, the reason they continue to function as comedy, even for viewers who were not alive when they first aired, has something to do with the density of what they contain. A typical episode from this period will have a primary plot, a secondary plot, a tertiary background gag running through both, at least one joke that is funny on the surface and much funnier if you catch the reference underneath it, at least one moment of genuine emotional truth buried inside the comedy, and a closing beat that manages to be both funny and surprisingly resonant. None of this happens accidentally. The writing rooms of the early and mid-90s Simpsons were staffed with people who were working at the edge of what the format could accommodate. They were also, by this point, working with characters who had been developed enough to have genuine interiority. Homer was no longer just a buffoon. He was a buffoon with a specific emotional architecture, a specific history, a specific relationship to failure and love and pride that made his buffoonery meaningful. The comedy came from character, not just from incident, and this is a distinction that separates good comedy from great comedy. The second cluster of answers is season 9 to 12, the post-golden years that many viewers consider uneven but still capable of genuine excellence. This is where you find The Principal and the Pauper, which earned considerable backlash but is, upon reflection, one of the show's most interesting experiments. The Joy of Sect, Homer versus Patty and Selma, and Behind the Laughter, the meta-mockumentary that treats the Simpsons family as real people being interviewed about the success and decline of their fictional television show. A conceit so layered that it barely makes sense to describe and absolutely makes sense to watch. This period also contains some of the show's most divisive episodes, moments where the comedy tips from absurdist into surreal in ways that don't always land, where the emotional grounding that made the earlier seasons so reliable starts to loosen, where the sense of Springfield as a place with consistent internal logic begins to yield to the demands of increasingly outlandish storylines. Fans of the earlier period point to this loosening as the beginning of a long decline. Defenders of the middle period point out that the earlier seasons are being remembered with selective nostalgia, that they contained their own weak episodes, their own misfires, their own moments of pure padding. Both groups are correct. The Simpsons has never been uniformly excellent across any stretch of its run. It has always contained variation, always had weeks where it coasted, and weeks where it surprised even itself. The third cluster, smaller but passionate, argues that the later seasons, the ones that most critics and longtime fans have largely given up on, contain genuine work worth attending to. These advocates are harder to dismiss than you might expect. They point to specific episodes, specific moments, specific creative choices that land in the later seasons in ways that the dismissive consensus about decline cannot accommodate. The argument is not that the later seasons equal the early seasons. It is that the early seasons have been accorded a kind of canonical perfection that no television can actually sustain, and that measuring everything against that standard is a way of ensuring nothing else can ever be good enough. There is something in this worth considering. The Simpsons in its later years is a different show from The Simpsons in its golden years. Not worse in every dimension different. The humor is broader. The emotional beats are less consistently earned. The willingness to be strange has become, at times, a willingness to be merely random, which is not the same thing. But the show also has, by virtue of its length, a relationship with its own history that no early season episode could have had. It can reference itself across decades. It can revisit characters who have 30 years of context behind them. It can produce anniversary episodes and callbacks and quiet acknowledgments of the distance traveled in ways that are genuinely moving for viewers who have been along for the full ride. A late-season Simpsons episode is, among other things, a kind of reunion. You are seeing these characters again? After all this time? And the pleasure of that is real even when the episode itself is only intermittently brilliant. This is, perhaps, the most honest thing you can say about the full arc of the show. It began as one of the great comedies in the history of the medium, and it became something else, less consistently excellent, more dependent on goodwill accumulated over decades, trading in a different currency than pure comedic invention. Neither version is the real Simpsons. Both versions are. The debate about the golden age is, underneath, a debate about something else entirely. It is a debate about the relationship between art and memory. The episodes you encountered first, at the age when television made its deepest impressions on you, will always seem to carry more weight than the episodes you encountered later. This is not a failing of the later material. It is a fact about how memory and emotional formation work. The things you experienced at 10 or 12 or 15 lodge themselves in a place that later experiences cannot easily reach. They feel more vivid not because they were better, but because you were more open when you received them. This means the golden age of The Simpsons is, to some extent, personal. It corresponds not to any objective span of seasons, but to whenever you were watching most closely, most hungrily, at the age when the show was telling you things about the world that you were just beginning to understand. For some people, that is Season 3. For some, it is Season 7. For someone watching the show for the first time right now, it might be Season 32. The show accommodates all of this. It has always accommodated all of this. That is one of its stranger and more generous qualities. Its willingness to mean different things to different people, arriving at it at different moments in their lives, and to remain capacious enough to hold all those different meanings without collapsing under the weight of them. There is no definitive answer to when The Simpsons peaked. There is only the episode you remember most clearly, the line you have quoted most often, the scene that landed in a way that surprised you into genuine feeling when you were not expecting it. That episode is your golden age. It is as real as any other. A note on the voice actors, the people behind the yellow skin. There is a quiet miracle at the center of The Simpsons that tends to get overlooked in discussions of the show's writing, its cultural impact, and its strange longevity. The miracle is this. The same small group of human beings has been giving voice to these characters for the entire run of the show, And in doing so, they have created one of the most recognizable sonic landscapes in the history of entertainment. Dan Castellaneta has voiced Homer Simpson since 1987, when the character first appeared in animated form. He has done this for almost 40 years. 40 years of the same voice, or rather, 40 years of a voice that has evolved almost imperceptibly, settling deeper into itself as both the character and the performer matured. Homer's voice in the early episodes is slightly different from Homer's voice in the later ones, slightly higher, slightly less settled, still finding its weight. By the time of the show's peak years, Homer sounds exactly like Homer. That specific combination of plaintiveness and indignation, of joy that never quite gets where it's going, and frustration that never quite turns into actual anger. Castellaneta has spoken about the evolution of the voice in interviews, noting that D.O. Homer's signature verbal stumble, now in the Oxford English Dictionary, was originally borrowed from a character played by the Scottish actor James Finlayson in Laurel and Hardy films. Finlayson would say something phonetically similar when things went wrong. Castellaneta adapted it, shortened it, gave it the particular forlorn music that Homer brings to it, and it became one of the most recognizable sounds in American popular culture. Julie Kavner, who voices Marge, has described her own process as something close to channeling, finding a place inside herself that corresponds to Marge's particular quality of concerned patience. Kavner's natural voice is already distinctive, slightly hoarse in a way that gives it texture and warmth, and she has deepened and shaped that quality across decades of recording sessions. Marge is not an easy character to voice because her emotional range is narrow on the surface and enormous underneath. The voice has to carry decades of a marriage, decades of raising 3 children, decades of being the structural support of a household that is constantly threatening to come apart. Kavner does this without calling attention to it. The voice is just there, doing its work, every episode. Nancy Cartwright was, at the time she auditioned for The Simpsons, primarily interested in playing Lisa. Bart seemed to her less interesting, a troublemaker, a type, a character defined by transgression rather than interiority. She was talked into auditioning for Bart, read a few lines, and immediately understood something about the character that changed her assessment. Underneath the transgression, there was a fundamental sweetness. Bart is not a bad kid. Bart is a kid who has been underestimated so consistently that acting out has become the only language through which he can reliably get attention. Cartwright heard this in the lines, found the register that carries both the bravado and the vulnerability, and created a voice that has been synonymous with a certain kind of American boyhood for 35 years. Yeardley Smith voices Lisa with a particular quality that is hard to describe, precisely something between earnestness and longing, an openness that makes Lisa's idealism feel genuine rather than preachy, even in moments when the writing is asking her to carry moral weight that would collapse a less carefully performed character. Smith has noted in interviews that she relates to Lisa in ways that sometimes make the recording sessions unexpectedly emotional, that Lisa's frustration with a world that doesn't quite make room for the kind of intelligence and sincerity she brings is not an abstract thing for Smith to access. Harry Shearer voices more major characters than anyone else in the cast. Mr. Burns, Smithers, Skinner, Ned Flanders, Kent Brockman, Dr. Hibbert, and a dozen others. This means Shearer has, at various points, recorded scenes where he plays multiple characters in the same scene, responding to himself, arguing with himself, finding distinct voices for characters who share the same recording booth. The technical skill this requires is considerable. The artistic skill, maintaining the specific humanity of each character, even while switching between them rapidly, is something rarer. Shearer has had a complicated relationship with the show over the years, publicly and occasionally acrimoniously. He left briefly, returned, expressed frustration with the creative direction at various points. But his voice work remains one of the show's essential pleasures, and Mr. Burns in particular is a creation that could not exist without the specific quality Shearer brings to it, the thin, slightly trembling menace, the aristocratic contempt delivered through what sounds like a voice that is barely strong enough to carry the weight of a complete sentence, the rare moments of vulnerability that arrive so unexpectedly that they register as genuinely moving, despite being performed by a cartoon villain. These 6 people, Castellaneta, Kavner, Cartwright, Smith, Shearer, and Hank Azaria, have constituted the core vocal cast of The Simpsons for most of its run. They have recorded thousands of episodes. They have spent a significant portion of their adult lives in a recording studio, standing at microphones, giving voice to drawings. The drawings have become famous in ways that the people behind them sometimes have not, or rather, in ways that are separate from the people behind them, so that the Yellow family and their specific sounds belong to the culture in a way that is both about and apart from the individuals who created those sounds. This is the strange economics of voice acting at the highest level. You create something that exceeds you, something that will outlast any individual performance, something that has taken on a life that continues beyond any recording session. The voice is yours and is not yours. Homer's voice belongs to Dan Castellaneta and also belongs to everyone who has ever laughed at it. That is a kind of art and a kind of gift, and it has been renewed every recording session for 35 years. One more thing. The Simpsons and the concept of home. There is a word that appears more often in discussions of The Simpsons than almost any other, and it is not comedy or satire or animation or even family. The word is home. People talk about The Simpsons as home, as a place they return to, as something that feels like the specific warmth of a familiar room, not a perfect room, not a clean room, not a room that has been arranged for guests, but a room that belongs to people who live in it and have lived in it for a long time and have left, everywhere, the comfortable evidence of that habitation. This is unusual for a piece of media to achieve, and it is worth pausing on. Most television shows, however well loved, are experienced as stories you visit. You enter them for the duration of an episode or a season, and then you leave them, carrying with you the emotions they generated. The Simpsons is experienced differently by many of its longest viewers, as a place you inhabit. The distinction is subtle but real. When you visit a story, you are an audience. When you inhabit a place, you are something closer to a resident. The reasons for this are partly structural. The floating timeline means the show never ages out of relevance, never arrives at a point where the characters have outgrown the world you knew them in. But they are also partly emotional, rooted in the specific quality of warmth that the show has maintained even through its less consistent years. Springfield is a place where people are fundamentally okay. Disasters happen and are survived. Catastrophes occur and are reset. The family argues and reconciles and argues again. Homer fails and is forgiven. Bart gets in trouble and is loved anyway. Lisa is misunderstood and keeps going. The house is always the house. This is, in essence, what a home is. A home is a place that holds you through the iterations of your life without requiring you to be different than you are. It accommodates your failures. It absorbs your noise. It is there when you leave and there when you come back. It is not perfect. It is yours. Springfield is that for a significant portion of the people who have ever watched this show. And that is, when you think about it, one of the stranger achievements in the history of mass entertainment. A fictional town, populated by yellow drawings, has become home to millions of real people in the way that only a handful of places in any life achieve the status of home. You carry Springfield with you. It is part of the furniture of your imagination. The particular shade of the sky over the nuclear plant, the specific sound of Homer's voice when everything is about to go wrong, the quiet of Marge's kitchen on an ordinary Springfield morning, these things live in you now, in the part of memory that stores the sensory texture of familiar places. That is what 35 years of good television and medium television and occasionally bewildering television accumulates to. Not a legacy or a cultural monument, though it is also those things. Something more intimate. A shared home, open to anyone who ever watched and let themselves be let in. The door is still open. The family is still on the couch. Come back whenever you need to. Section 8. Fact number 1. Tier. The one that changes everything? The show that outlived its own audience. And now we arrive here. Fact number 1. The wildest, strangest, most genuinely mind-altering fact about The Simpsons, not because it involves a bizarre production anecdote, not because it concerns a numerical coincidence, not because someone accidentally predicted something, but because it is a fact about time itself and about what happens when a piece of art lives long enough to witness the people who first loved it begin to disappear. Let that settle for a moment. You are comfortable right now. You are somewhere soft, somewhere quiet. The world outside has slowed down. And what I am about to tell you is something that sounds, at first, like a simple piece of arithmetic. But if you let it breathe, if you follow it all the way to where it goes, it becomes something closer to philosophy. Here is the fact. The Simpsons premiered on the 17th of December, 1989. On that night, roughly 330 million people were living in the United States. The show's first episode drew approximately 26 million viewers. Since that premiere across the 5+ years that have followed, the United States has experienced what demographers call the natural mortality of a generation. People who were alive in 1989 have died, many millions of them. Actuarial tables suggest that somewhere between 1 in 14 and 1 in 20 Americans who were alive on the night The Simpsons first aired are no longer alive today. Think about that number. Sit with it quietly. Somewhere between 16 and 23 million people saw The Simpsons begin. Some of them were old. Some were middle-aged. Some were young adults. Some were children who are now well into their 40s. A meaningful fraction of all of them, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps more, have since died. The show continued. Homer kept eating donuts. Bart kept writing on the chalkboard. Marge kept standing at the kitchen counter with that patient, slightly exhausted expression she has always worn. The world changed enormously. The people watching changed. Some of them stopped being people at all. In the physical sense, they left, they departed, they are gone in the way that all things eventually go. And the show kept airing. The Simpsons, in other words, has outlived a measurable portion of its original audience. This is not a morbid thought, exactly. Or rather, it is morbid, but in the way that looking at old photographs is morbid. There is grief in it, but there is also something like wonder. Because what does it mean for a piece of art to persist that long? What does it mean that the same yellow family, in the same yellow house, with the same nuclear plant, and the same bar, and the same school, is still there, still intact, still airing while an entire demographic cohort of human beings has come and gone around it? Homer Simpson was 36 years old in the early seasons of the show. He has remained, more or less, in his late 30s for every year since. The people who watched him in 1989 and were also 36 years old at the time are now in their early 70s. Some of them have grandchildren, some of them have died. Homer is still 36. Homer will still be 36 next year and the year after, and however many years remain before the show finally ends or the network finally closes. He does not age. They did. There is something almost uncanny about this when you hold it at the right angle. The Simpsons exists in what scholars of narrative call a floating timeline, a form of deliberate temporal suspension in which characters do not age even as the world around them does. The real-world dates change, cultural references update, the technology in the show shifts from rotary phones to smartphones to whatever comes next. But Homer and Marge are always the same age. Bart is always 10, Lisa is always 8. Maggie is always the baby who has not yet spoken her first word in any canonical sense. They are frozen, their audience is not. And this creates a situation that has no real precedent in the history of entertainment. A movie ages with you, you watch it at 25 and again at 50, and you feel the distance between those two viewings in your bones. A song can follow you through decades and carry the specific emotional residue of every year you've known it. But The Simpsons is something stranger, a continuous, ongoing thing that keeps producing new material while never acknowledging the passage of time, meaning it occupies a peculiar position in the lives of its oldest fans. It is always new and always the same simultaneously. It is there when you are young, and it is still there when you are old, and it does not seem to notice the difference. For people who grew up with the show in the early years, who were children or teenagers in 1989, 1990, 1991, The Simpsons has now been present for their entire adult lives. It was there when they graduated. It was there when they got married or didn't get married, when they had children or didn't have children, when they moved cities and changed careers and lost people and found new ones. It was always in the background, always airing, always available. Homer and Marge and the kids, just living their frozen life in Springfield, unaware of what was happening in the real world around them. And then some of those people stopped watching. Not because they lost interest, though some did, but because they died. They got sick, they had accidents, they grew old in the way that human beings grow old, which is to say, inevitably and on a schedule that cannot be negotiated. And The Simpsons kept going. There is a particular kind of melancholy in this that is hard to name precisely. It is not grief, exactly, because you cannot grieve a television show for continuing to exist. But it is something adjacent to grief, a recognition of asymmetry, of the way that the things we make can sometimes outlast the people who made them meaningful. Think of all the living rooms where The Simpsons has aired. All the families who watched it together on Sunday nights in the early 1990s, the parents who sat with their children on the couch, the fathers who laughed at Homer's absurdity in a way that felt a little too personal, the mothers who recognized something in Marge's patient exhaustion, the children who thought Bart was the coolest person they had ever seen. Those families dispersed. The children grew up and moved out. The parents aged. Some of those parents are no longer alive. And The Simpsons is still there, still airing on Sunday nights, carrying the invisible weight of all those living rooms that no longer exist. This is what makes it the #1 fact on this list. It is not a production curiosity. It is not a strange behind-the-scenes story. It is a fact about the nature of long-running art, about what happens when a piece of culture persists long enough to become a kind of monument. The Simpsons began as a cartoon about a dysfunctional family in a fictional American town. It is now also a record of time. It is a document of the late 20th and early 21st century, as experienced by a single unchanging family who never grow older and never die and never leave Springfield. The people who watch them do age. The people who watch them do die. Springfield endures. There is a philosopher named Paul Ricoeur who wrote about what he called narrative time, the idea that stories are one of the primary ways human beings process the passage of time, that we use narratives to give shape and meaning to the otherwise formless flow of years and decades. By Ricoeur's framework, The Simpsons is doing something almost paradoxical. It is a narrative about stasis, a story that keeps moving forward without ever actually going anywhere, that uses the vocabulary of narrative characters, conflict, resolution, without submitting to narrative's most fundamental rule, which is that things change. And yet, somehow, it works. Somehow, this impossible frozen family has become a fixture in the lives of tens of millions of people who do change, who do age, who do eventually stop watching for the permanent reason. It accompanies them without transforming alongside them. It is the constant in a world of variables. When The Simpsons eventually ends, and it will end, everything ends, there will be people alive who will have no memory of a world without it. People born in 1989 have never known a world without The Simpsons. They were born into a world where it already existed. They have grown up, graduated, had their own children, watched their own children grow up, all with The Simpsons running in the background like ambient music, like wallpaper, like the particular quality of light on Sunday evenings. When it ends, they will lose something they have never been without. That is strange. That is genuinely, quietly, profoundly strange. Not in a sensational way, not in the way of a shocking production story or a statistical coincidence, but in a way that reaches into something deeper. The Simpsons is, among other things, a meditation on continuity, on what it means to keep going, on what it means to stay the same while everything around you changes. Homer Simpson does not know that millions of the people who first laughed at him are gone. He doesn't know because he cannot know he is a drawing, a construction, a yellow man in a fictional town who exists only in the minds of the people watching him. But the people who made him, and the people who have loved him, and the people who have watched him stumble through 700 plus episodes of gentle catastrophe, they know. They carry that knowledge in the background of every viewing, every rewatch, every Sunday night when the familiar theme music starts and the family rushes to the couch and nothing has changed. Everything has changed. That is fact #1. Not a prediction, not a coincidence, not a strange piece of trivia about a voice actor or a background gag or a contract dispute. Just the slow, enormous, quietly devastating fact that The Simpsons has been alive long enough to watch its audience age and die, and it has not aged or died alongside them. It keeps going. The family stays on the couch. And if you are watching right now, wherever you are, whatever time it is, you are one of the people it has not lost yet. You are here, and the show is here, and for a little while longer, the yellow light of The Simpsons' living room is still flickering somewhere, against the dark. Sleep well with that thought. Let it be gentle rather than heavy. Because there is something comforting in it too, if you hold it at the right angle. The things we love persist, even when we can't. There is one more thing worth saying about this fact before we move on, something that makes it even more layered when you think about it carefully. The Simpsons has, over the course of its run, depicted death hundreds of times. Characters have died, come back, died again. Homer himself has died in Treehouse of Horror episodes more times than most people can count, crushed, eaten, dissolved, reversed out of existence by a time-traveling toaster. The show has always had a comfortable, almost cheerful relationship with mortality, treating it as one more absurdist element of the universe it inhabits. But the show has never depicted what is actually happening outside of it, the real, non-comedic, entirely non-reversible deaths of the people who watch it. The Simpsons universe is sealed. Springfield exists in a bubble where consequences are limited, and resurrection is always available. Meanwhile, in the world where the show plays on screens and televisions and phones and laptops, the audience is doing what all audiences eventually do. This disjunction between the immortal yellow family and their mortal, aging, disappearing viewers is something that has never been addressed in the show itself, because of course it cannot be. You cannot put it in a script. There is no episode about this. There is no Treehouse of Horror segment where Homer realizes that somewhere, in a real house, the real person watching him has just learned they are terminally ill, or has just had a phone call that changed everything, or has just had their last ordinary evening before their life became unrecognizable. The show does not know about these moments. It cannot know. But the moments exist, and they have been accumulating for 35 years. In 35 years' worth of living rooms where the show was playing in the background, while the real drama of real lives unfolded in the foreground. All those last Sunday nights, all those final episodes watched without knowing they were final. There is a particular kind of viewer, and if you have been watching long enough, you have probably been this viewer at least once, who watches The Simpsons and feels a specific kind of nostalgic ache that is hard to explain to someone who doesn't feel it. It is not about the quality of the episodes, early versus late, golden age versus decline. It is something more intimate. The sense that watching the show is also watching yourself in relation to the show. Watching how far you have traveled from the person you were when you first discovered it, watching how many things have changed while the Simpsons family has stayed put, that ache is the show's real secret. It is not the predictions, not the voice cast, not the cultural satire. It is the fact that a frozen family can make you feel the passage of your own time more acutely than almost anything else. That is what makes it number one. Section 9, the Extended Catalog. Bonus facts, hidden depths, and stray wonders. We have made it through the ranked list. The countdown is complete. But there is something about The Simpsons that resists clean endings. The show itself has always been resistant to tidy conclusions, preferring instead to let its episodes sprawl slightly past their assigned runtime, to let the credits roll over a joke that didn't quite need to be there but was better for being included. So, consider this section the equivalent of that. The joke after the credits. The extra moment before the lights come up. There is more to say about this show, there is always more to say, and some of it is too good to leave on the cutting room floor just because the official ranking has reached its conclusion. Let's begin with Ned Flanders, because Ned Flanders deserves his own extended meditation. Ned Flanders is, on the surface, Homer's annoyingly virtuous neighbor. He is cheerful in the face of disaster, generous to the point of absurdity, religious in a way that is portrayed with surprising nuance for a primetime cartoon, and patient with Homer's hostility to a degree that has occasionally struck viewers as less realistic and more saint-like. But here is the thing about Ned Flanders that most casual viewers don't know. He was originally conceived as the show's villain. Not a cartoonish villain, not a scheming antagonist, but the kind of villain that is actually more unsettling than a cartoon one. The early writers considered Ned a representation of a specific type of social pressure. The neighbor who is so conspicuously good that his goodness becomes a form of judgment. His happiness was meant to be oppressive. His success, the nice house, the healthy family, the thriving business, was meant to stand as a constant implicit accusation against Homer's chaotic, impulsive, undisciplined life. Over time, the show softened this, and Ned became something more complicated and more beloved. He became genuinely good, not sarcastically, not as a foil, but as a real character with real grief and real warmth. The episode in which Maud Flanders dies alone again, Natura Diddley from 2000, is one of the most emotionally genuine things the show has ever produced. A half hour of actual mourning for a character who had been a recurring presence for over a decade. Ned's grief is not played for laughs. it is played straight, and it landed, for many viewers, as one of the most unexpectedly moving experiences the show ever offered. This is the paradox of Ned Flanders. He began as a structural antagonist and ended as one of the show's most emotionally resonant characters. His arc, if you can call it that in a show where arcs are officially discouraged, is the arc of becoming genuinely real. And now, because we are here and we have time, a small note about the Flanders family's origin that very few people know. Ned's last name Flanders was chosen by Matt Groening as a tribute to a street in Portland, Oregon, where Groening grew up. N.E. Flanders Street runs through Portland's Pearl District. The real Flanders Street is, in most respects, an entirely ordinary Portland street. It does not particularly resemble the kind of neighborhood the fictional Ned would choose to live in. But it was there, it had the right sound, and it became the name of one of the most recognizable supporting characters in American television history. Portland contains, without knowing it, a small architectural monument to a fictional character who was named after it. Let's talk about Hans Moleman. Hans Moleman is, officially, one of the great accidental successes in television history. He was designed as a one-off character, a very small, very old, perpetually unfortunate man with bad eyesight and no discernible reason to exist beyond a single gag. His original name was Ralph Mellish. At some point, this was changed to Hans Moleman for reasons that the writers have never been entirely clear about. He was given a mournful voice, a permanent squint, and an apparently infinite capacity to suffer. The suffering is key. Hans Moleman has, across the show's run, experienced what can only be described as an escalating catalog of catastrophe. He has been set on fire. He has been crushed. He has fallen. He has been electrocuted. He has been used as a human bowling ball. He has at various points been declared dead, only to reappear in subsequent episodes with no explanation offered and none expected. In one famous episode, he presents a short film at the Springfield Film Festival. The film is titled Man Getting Hit by Football. It is exactly what it sounds like. Hans Moleman, or a character played by Hans Moleman, walks toward the camera and is struck in a sensitive location by a football. The film has no other content. Hans Moleman believes this film represents the finest work of his career. The audience in the show boos it. The audience watching the show has, for 30 years, considered it one of the funniest things the show has ever produced. This tells you something about the gap between what characters experience and what audiences find delightful, and also something about the particular comic genius of Hans Moleman as a character. He suffers constantly, he is unaware of why, and he maintains throughout an air of slightly confused dignity that makes his suffering somehow even more funny and even more poignant than it would otherwise be. Hans Moleman is the show's philosopher clown. He exists in a state of pure, unearned misfortune, and he persists. There is something almost inspiring about that if you look at it right. Now let's talk about music, because The Simpsons has a relationship with music that is both stranger and more impressive than most people realize. The show's composer, Alf Clausen, scored The Simpsons for decades with an orchestra. A real orchestra, actual musicians, actual recording sessions, actual live performance of original music written specifically for each episode. This was, and remains, almost unheard of for an animated series. Most animated shows use synthesized music or stock cues or electronic scoring. The Simpsons had a full orchestral budget, and Clausen used it. The result is a show with a musical vocabulary far richer than its animated format might suggest. The underscore of a typical Simpsons episode contains melodic themes, harmonic development, actual counterpoint. There are quotes from classical composers embedded in background cues. There are jazz influences and Broadway influences and film score references all woven into the texture of what sounds, to the casual ear, like cartoon music. Clausen was eventually replaced in 2017, which prompted considerable discussion among fans of the show. But his body of work spanning well over 2 decades of weekly episodes represents one of the most extensive catalogs of original orchestral music ever composed for a single television program. The Simpsons, among everything else it is a significant piece of the history of television music. There is also the matter of the musical episodes. Bart After Dark contains original songs. Homer's Barbershop Quartet contains an entire arc about a band called the B-Sharps, who achieve Beatles-level fame before an inevitable implosion. The Simpsons has hosted guest appearances from musicians including Michael Jackson, credited under a pseudonym, Paul McCartney, Linda Ronstadt, Elvis Costello, Sonic Youth, The Ramones, and many others. Each of these appearances produced music that was specifically written for the show, original songs that exist nowhere else. The Ramones appeared in Rosebud, the season 5 episode in which Mr. Burns attempts to reclaim his lost childhood teddy bear. In one of the great collision of worlds moments in the show's history, the Ramones perform Happy Birthday to Mr. Burns at his birthday party. Mr. Burns, not knowing who the Ramones are, watches them perform and then turns to an aide and says, quietly, "Have the Rolling Stones killed." The Ramones found this extremely funny. It is extremely funny. Let's stay with the house for a moment, because the Simpsons house at 742 Evergreen Terrace is one of the most analyzed fictional residences in the history of popular culture, and some of what has been discovered about it is genuinely baffling. The house changes. Not just slightly, not just in the way that all animated properties allow themselves occasional inconsistencies. The house at 742 Evergreen Terrace has, across its run, featured different room configurations, different numbers of bedrooms, different basement layouts, and a garage that seems to exist in a state of quantum uncertainty about what it contains and how it connects to the rest of the structure. This has been the subject of serious analysis. Architectural enthusiasts have attempted to generate floor plans from the show's visual evidence, and the results are incompatible with Euclidean geometry. Rooms that should share a wall do not. Rooms that appear only once never appear again. The basement is simultaneously accessible from the kitchen and from the garage and from the living room, depending on which episode you are watching. One analysis concluded, somewhat philosophically, that 742 Evergreen Terrace is a house that contains more space than it should, and that this extra space is being used differently depending on the narrative needs of the episode. The house, in other words, obeys story logic rather than architectural logic. You could say the same about Springfield itself. Springfield is a city that has a coastline and is also landlocked, depending on the episode. It has mountains and is also flat. It is close to Shelbyville and is also very far from it. It is in a state whose name is never spoken, and it has been placed by various references in the vicinity of Ohio, Missouri, Kentucky, California, and Maine, among others. The Simpsons has always maintained that Springfield's location is deliberately unknowable, that the vagueness is intentional, a way of making the show feel universal rather than regional. Matt Groening confirmed this explicitly, and for decades it was treated as a charming open secret. But there is a secondary effect of this deliberate vagueness that is less often discussed. It means Springfield has no neighbors, geographically speaking. It cannot be approached from any direction because it has no direction. It exists in a kind of permanent geographic present tense, surrounded by nothing in particular, adjacent to everywhere and nowhere. This is, if you think about it, the perfect setting for a show that also exists in a permanent temporal present tense. Springfield is where time doesn't pass. Springfield is where nothing has a fixed position. Springfield is the setting for a story that is always happening and never really going anywhere. And Homer Simpson lives there, and will always live there, eating donuts and loving his family badly and well, in a house that shouldn't be able to contain all the rooms it contains, in a city that shouldn't be able to contain all the landscapes it contains, in a show that somehow contains, after 35 years, most of what American life has looked like across an entire generation. That is the extended catalog. That is the bonus round. And now, with all of that said, with the facts ranked and the bonus content delivered, and the full strange scope of this show laid out in the dark, it is time for the last thing. The closing thought. The moment before sleep. Before we leave this section entirely, there are a few more corners of the Simpsons universe worth wandering into, because this is that kind of night, unhurried, spacious, with nowhere to be. Consider the show's relationship with language. The Simpsons has contributed more words and phrases to the English language than almost any other single piece of media in the last 40 years. Meh, that two-letter expression of supreme indifference, was popularized, if not invented, by the show. D.O. is now officially listed in the Oxford English Dictionary, defined as used to comment on a foolish or stupid action, especially one's own. Homer Simpson's verbal stumble has been canonized in one of the most prestigious reference works in the English language. But it goes further than the obvious examples. The phrase embiggen, used in the episode Lisa the Iconoclast, in the context of Springfield's town motto, "A noble spirit embiggens the smallest man," was presented in the show as a perfectly cromulent word, with cromulent itself being another invention of that same episode. Both words were coined by writer David X. Cohen. Both words passed into relatively common usage in the years following the episode's air date. Embiggen is now used in scientific and technical contexts. Marvel Comics used it as the name of a character's superpower. NASA has used it in technical documentation about image processing. A word invented for a single joke in a 1996 episode of a cartoon is now used by space scientists. Cromulent, meanwhile, has become the go-to term for something that is ostensibly legitimate or acceptable while being slightly absurd. A word for perfectly adequate mediocrity, a compliment that is also not quite a compliment. The word has no origin except The Simpsons, and it has filled a gap in the language that speakers apparently didn't know existed until it was filled. This happens with great art sometimes. A piece of culture arrives and names something that previously had no name, and the naming itself changes how people think about the thing. The Simpsons has done this repeatedly, so often that it's easy to take it for granted. There is also the matter of the chalkboard gags, which deserve more attention than they typically receive. At the beginning of each episode, Bart is seen writing a sentence repeatedly on a school chalkboard, as punishment for some transgression that is never shown. The sentence changes each week. It is a cold open joke, a quick visual gag that plays over the opening credits, and for most viewers it registers as background information before the episode proper begins. But the chalkboard gags, taken as a complete archive, form a record of the show's changing preoccupations, cultural anxieties, and sense of humor across 3 decades. Early chalkboard gags were fairly simple. Later ones became more meta, more self-referential, sometimes directly commenting on the show's own situation. There have been chalkboard gags that reference contract disputes, network decisions, fan complaints, and the general strangeness of being a show that has been on the air long enough to develop opinions about itself. Scholars of comedy have analyzed the chalkboard gags as a kind of miniature essay series, 40 words or fewer, repeated across the screen, conveying a complete comedic idea. The constraint is similar to haiku. The limitation produces clarity. You cannot ramble in a chalkboard gag. You have one sentence and you have to land it. Some of the best chalkboard gags are genuinely excellent comedy writing, compressed to its absolute essence. "I will not waste chalk" is the one that gets cited most often, for obvious reasons. It is perfect. It is 3 seconds of television that contains its own contradiction, its own small argument with itself, and it was done and gone before you fully registered it. That's the show all over, in a way. So much of what The Simpsons does best happens quickly, almost subliminally, in the spaces between the main jokes and the primary plots. The real density of the show is in its margins and the background signs. The chalkboard gags, the names on the credits, the barely audible one-liners from minor characters walking past the frame. It is a show that rewards attention in a very specific way, not by revealing a complex mythology or a carefully seated plot, but by offering, to anyone who is paying close enough attention, an almost infinite reservoir of small, well-constructed jokes. You can watch an episode 30 times and still find something new, not because the show is hiding secrets, but because it was built with a density of craft that exceeds what any single viewing can absorb. This is, in its own way, another strange fact about The Simpsons. It is one of the most watched television programs in history, and it is still, in some sense, undiscovered. There are always more background gags. There are always more throwaway lines. There are always more careful little constructions sitting quietly in the margins, waiting for the right viewer at the right moment. The show never runs out. That is the bonus round, properly concluded. Section 10, Closing Reflection. Springfield at the Edge of Sleep. You have made it here, through 30 facts, through the ranked tiers of the mildly unusual and the genuinely strange and the quietly unsettling. Through the production histories and the voice actor accidents and the mathematical predictions and the Scrabble tiles and the frozen timeline and the language that escaped the show and entered the real world and embedded itself in the dictionary and in scientific papers and in the way people talk to each other on ordinary days. You are here, now, at the end of the list and the beginning of sleep. The room around you is quiet. Whatever the weather is outside, rain, or the particular silence that comes after rain, or the soft press of late heat in summer, or the still cold of winter. None of it requires anything from you right now. You have no task. There is nowhere to be. The darkness behind your eyes is not emptiness. It is a kind of fullness, a waiting space that is about to fill with whatever the night brings. Let's stay in Springfield for just a little longer. Springfield, that impossible town, that city without a state, without a coastline that stays still, without a geography that commits to anything, the town where nothing is resolved, but everything is returned to. Homer wakes up each morning and goes to work at the nuclear plant, or doesn't go to work, or discovers a new passion that will last exactly 22 minutes before the credits roll and everything resets. Marge cooks and worries and loves. With a completeness that the show rarely stops to celebrate explicitly, she is just there, constant, providing the gravity that holds the family in orbit around itself. Bart is 10 years old forever, which means he is also perpetually on the verge of something. On the verge of growing up, on the verge of getting in real trouble, on the verge of becoming the person the show keeps hinting he might become, before it gently steps back and returns him to exactly where it found him. He is potential without consequence, energy without direction, a child at the apex of childhood who never has to fall out of it. Lisa is 8 and brilliant and sad in the way that brilliant 8-year-olds are sometimes sad aware of too much, armed with too little power to change it, playing her saxophone on the front step of a house that doesn't quite deserve the quality of music she produces there. Lisa is the show's conscience, and the show knows she is the show's conscience, and there is something honest about the way it treats that role, not as a position of triumph, but as a position of ongoing, low-grade effort. Lisa is always trying. The world of the show rarely meets her at the level she is trying to reach. She keeps trying anyway. Maggie is the smallest of them, and in some ways the most interesting. She does not speak, or speaks so rarely that each instance of speech becomes an event. She observes everything from her position near the floor, shooting that serious look at whatever is happening around her, occasionally in the show's more playful moments doing something extraordinary. She saved Homer's life. She has been identified as remarkably intelligent in dream sequences and fantasy sequences, and in the subtle grammar of what the show chooses to give her in the margins of episodes. Maggie may be the most capable person in Springfield. She cannot yet talk in full sentences. The gap between those two facts is one of the show's best-running observations about the relationship between ability and circumstance. And then there is Springfield itself, the bar, and the school, and the nuclear plant, and the church, and the Quickie Mart with Apu's patient cheerfulness behind the counter, the retirement castle, and the police station, and the courthouse, and all the other institutions of a mid-century American town preserved in amber, kept running by the same cast of recurring faces who have been populating the background of this fictional city for 35 years. They are all still there, in the episodes that keep getting made. Moe is still at the bar. Chief Wiggum is still inexplicably running the police department. Principal Skinner is still locked in his perpetual conflict with Superintendent Chalmers. Krusty is still performing for children despite an evident distaste for performing for children. They are all still there, these secondary and tertiary citizens of Springfield, holding down the texture of a town that should not be able to feel as real as it does, given that it is a cartoon town that has never committed to a state or a geography or a consistent floor plan. And yet it does feel real. To anyone who has spent enough time with it, Springfield feels more real than many real places. Its emotional geography, the way the bar is always available when Homer needs to think, the way the church is always available when the show needs to explore what it means to believe in something, the way Lisa's school is always a space where intelligence is both recognized and constrained. This emotional geography is more consistent than any physical map could ever be. Springfield is the place you go to remember what American life has felt like across the last 3.5 decades. It is a time capsule that keeps updating itself, a living record of a culture looking at itself and finding the result both horrifying and deeply helplessly funny. You have spent this time here, in that town, collecting these facts, turning them over in your mind the way you might turn over interesting stones found on a long walk, not to do anything with them, just to feel their weight, to appreciate their strangeness, to let them tell you something about the kind of world that could produce them. And now it is time to set them down. The facts will still be there in the morning. The show will still be there. Homer will still be at the plant, or failing to be at the plant, or discovering a new passion with the particular brand of enthusiasm that always precedes the inevitable 22-minute arc back to exactly where he started. But for now, for this particular moment, which is quieter than most moments, there is nothing to collect, nothing to hold on to, nothing to think about except the slow, comfortable process of becoming less awake. The night outside is doing its ordinary work. The stars, if they are visible where you are doing the thing they have always done, existing at incomprehensible distances, emitting light that left them long before anyone in this story, real or fictional, was born. The darkness between the stars is where most of the universe actually is, and it is not hostile darkness. It is the same darkness that is around you right now, the darkness of a room where nothing requires your attention. Springfield is still there, frozen in its Sunday evening. Homer is in his chair. Marge is in the kitchen or beside him. The children are doing whatever children do in the last few minutes before an episode needs to wrap up. The dog is there, and the cat, and the sound of a television playing in a living room in a town that doesn't exist and also exists everywhere. Let the show play without you for a while. Let your breathing slow down. The facts are done. The ranking is complete. You know things now about this show that you may not have known when we started. Small things, strange things, things that seem like they shouldn't matter but do, somehow, in the particular way that the details of a beloved thing always matter more than they have any logical reason to. And you are here, and you are comfortable, and the night has reached the part where it requires nothing from you. Sleep is not a destination. It is a direction. You are already moving toward it. The thoughts are getting lighter. The day is getting further away. The facts, the 30 facts, the bonus facts, the philosophical fact at the top of the list, that is really a meditation on time, are settling somewhere in the back of the mind where good things settle when you stop needing to actively hold them. Springfield is still there. Homer is still in his chair. The couch is still the couch. And wherever you are, in whatever room, in whatever city, in whatever country, in whatever version of the night the world has given you, you are somewhere that is doing the same thing Springfield is doing, holding the people inside it while the dark continues, while the time passes, while the story, very slowly, continues. Good night. Production notes for 11 Labs voiceover. Voice style, warm baritone or mellow alto. The tone should suggest late-night public radio, calm, intelligent, unhurried. Think more documentary narrator at 11 p.m. than bedtime story for children. The audience is adults who are tired, but not yet asleep, and the narration should meet them at that exact register. Pacing, slower than conversational. Allow pauses at paragraph breaks, particularly after rhetorical questions and at section transitions. The script is written to accommodate silence. Don't rush to fill it. Emphasis. The script largely avoids bold emphasis because the emphasis is built into the sentence structure. Trust the writing. Read it as written rather than adding performance emphasis on top of it. Section transitions. At the dividers, a pause of 2-4 seconds is appropriate. These are genuine transitions between emotional registers, and they benefit from breath. Numbers and dates. Read them naturally. 1989, not 1989. Spell out mathematical concepts rather than reading numerals. The script is already written this way. Follow its lead. Tone note. The script moves between slightly playful, sections 1-4, and genuinely reflective, sections 7-10. The voice should track this arc not dramatically, but as a gradual warming and deepening. By section 10, the delivery should be very quiet, very close, very present. This is the section that people will hear as they are falling asleep, and it should feel like someone who is there with them. Subscriber CTA, end of section 1. This should be delivered slightly warmer and more direct than the narration, as if briefly stepping out of the story to address the audience personally, then stepping back in. Keep it brief and genuine. End of script. Total target, 25,000 plus words. Sections, 10. Format, sleep narration, 11 Labs voiceover, extended closing for longer sleep sessions. This section can be added after the main closing for longer format uploads. There is something that happens in the long stretch of the night, after the day's energy has fully released and before the first intimation of morning begins to make itself felt. It is not quite wakefulness and not quite sleep. It is a threshold state, a kind of dwelling in between, and it is one of the more peaceful places the human nervous system can occupy. You may be there now. If you are, let this be the part of the evening where the thoughts slow down to the pace of breath, where the facts about Springfield and the Simpsons family and all their strange, beautiful, surprising history become less like information and more like texture, part of the fabric of the night, woven in alongside the sound of whatever is outside your window and the familiar weight of your own body at rest. The Simpsons has been the backdrop to so many nights like this one. Not this specific kind of night. Not everyone falls asleep to it, narrated slowly in the dark, but Sunday nights for decades, the particular end-of-weekend mood that the show has been part of for millions of people across its entire run. There is something about Sunday night that feels both like an ending and a continuity, the week wrapping up, the new week waiting, and in the space between them, the comfortable ritual of a familiar show playing in a familiar living room. Springfield is always in Sunday evening. It exists there permanently, the way certain places exist permanently in memory, not as specific moments, but as a quality of light, a temperature, a feeling, the amber glow of the Simpsons' living room window, the particular blue of Springfield's sky in establishing shots, the way the nuclear plant's cooling towers appear on the horizon of almost every exterior scene, familiar and slightly absurd and always there. These images have been part of the visual vocabulary of American culture for long enough that they feel natural, now self-evident, always existing, impossible to imagine not existing. And yet someone drew them, someone designed them, someone decided on exactly that shade of yellow and exactly that shape of house and exactly that expression on Homer's face. Someone made these choices, and the choices became familiar, and the familiar became beloved, and the beloved became part of the texture of how an entire generation understands what family looks like when rendered in primary colors. That is the act of culture working at its best. Not instructing, not moralizing, not delivering a message, just being there, consistently, offering the same thing each time, until the thing it offers becomes something people cannot imagine being without. The Simpsons will end, eventually. There will be a final episode, a last chalkboard gag, a last couch gag, a last donut, a last utterance from Homer that will take its place in the archive of all the things he has ever said. The credits will roll and the music will play, and it will be over in the way that everything is eventually over. And a vast number of people will feel something that is hard to describe, not quite grief, but its gentle cousin, the feeling you get when something that has always been there is no longer there, and the absence it leaves is exactly the shape of the thing that was there. That has not happened yet. The show is still going. The family is still on the couch. And you are still here too, still on your own couch, or your bed, or wherever you are, in the quiet of this evening, still breathing slowly, still in that pleasant space between the day and the dream, still in the company of 30 facts about a show that has been part of the cultural air you breathe for most of your life, or all of it, depending on when you arrived. Springfield knows you, even if it doesn't know your name. You know Springfield, even if you have never been there. That is the deal. That is the quiet agreement between a long-running piece of culture and its audience. You bring your attention, it brings its consistency. You bring your evening, it brings its glow. Neither of you has to say anything about it. The understanding is already there, has been there for years, will be there for as long as both of you are. The rest is silence and rest and the comfortable dark. Sleep when you're ready. Springfield will be there in the morning.